Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto was the imperfect hero everyone rejected? Part 3. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to support my channel for more fanfic like this. I hope and now let's start the fanfic. Arrival in Lothlorien. There were soft voices in the air, and although none sounded vaguely familiar, the language definitely was. It was that of the Sylvan folk from the east, and although Ellenmeyer had never traveled beyond the borders of Imladris, Lord Elrond had taught her well in speech. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up in confusion at the golden leaves that shimmered just above her head. She was in a tree, that was certain, but even with her elven eyes, she could not discern where the tops finally reached out to the sky's embrace. She knew she was flat on her back, but it did not feel as though she were lying prone on a mere branch. She tried to lift her head slowly, but a wave of dizziness caused her to lie back down. She panicked momentarily. Elves never got dizzy, nor did they ever regain consciousness with their eyes closed. What has happened? She muttered groggily, and her hand flew to her throat at the harshness of her voice. Ah, child, a male answered in the elvish tongue. It is time you have awoken. She carefully turned her head toward the sound, and her eyes grew wide at the sight of the elf in front of her. He was attired in a beautifully embroidered tunic of silver and gold, and a green cloak fell from his shoulders. His light hair shone even in the darkness of the night, and his ethereal glow enhanced his beauty. A small gasp escaped Ellenmeyer's lips before she could prevent it, and she turned away shyly, well aware of her plain features. His beauty was far beyond that of an average elf, reminding her very much so of a certain prince of Mirkwood. Who are you? She questioned, avoiding his gaze. Where am I, and what has happened? You are in the realm of the Golden Wood, Ellenmeyer, he answered with a smile. Lothlorien, she called out in alarm. How? Her voice trailed off as cloudy memories began to replay in her mind. Thoughts of the darkness of Moria brought shivers to her arms, and she hugged herself tightly, shaking her head to rid herself of the coldness that had begun to creep into her body. Then, without warning, Gandalf's fall into the great abyss beneath the bridge of Khazad-dûm struck her like a flash of lightning, and tears sprung to her eyes. She looked up tearfully at the mysterious elf, unanswered questions flashing across her face, and she struggled for a moment to decide which to ask first. Who are you? She repeated. My name is Halder, he answered in the common tongue. A strange accent decorated his words, and a flash of amusement teased the corners of Ellenmeyer's lips. We have not had dealings with those from other lands, therefore we rarely speak in any tongue other than our own. She nodded in understanding. Where exactly are my companions? She asked, slowly pulling herself up into a sitting position. The dizziness she had experienced seconds before did not return, much to her relief, and she looked about her. Her eyes widened at the vastness of the forest and at the beauty of the majestic Meliorn, and immediately she realized what she had been lying on. It was a talon, or a wooden platform, that had been built into the branches of the tree, and there were a number of talons scattered throughout. Behind you, young one, are your halfling friends, Halder explained, pointing them out, and only then did Ellenmeyer notice the 4 tiny bodies. Merry, Pippin, and Sam were asleep, but Frodo was breathing far too heavily. She knew he was still awake, even if his closed eyes tried to show otherwise. What of the others? She questioned and furrowed her brow. She watched as Halder extended his hand out gracefully, pointing at the next Meliorn over, and there were the rest. Aragorn, Boromir, Gimli, and Mary Sue were all asleep, bundled in fur blankets, most likely provided by the elves of Lorien, but Legolas was on his feet, his eyes wide as he stared back at her in disbelief, and within another moment, he quickly disappeared from her sight. Where is Legolas going? Halder inquired, his voice tinged with slight annoyance. He must watch the dwarf. Gimli is no threat, Ellenmeyer defended, swerving her head and locking her gray eyes with his. This time she did not look away, as uncomfortable as she was. Halder still looked genuinely worried, but before he could speak another word, Legolas's head emerged from the bottom of the talon, and he climbed up swiftly the rest of the way. Halder, he greeted with a slight nod of his head. I must speak with her. But you must have an eye on that dwarf. Halder protested. He is asleep, and I assure you, even if he were awake, he is no trouble, Legolas stated, a hint of a plea in his tone. Halder's eyes narrowed, but he soon climbed down the ladder the same way Legolas had climbed up, and sure enough, the two spotted him as he took post where Legolas had been mere minutes before. Ellenmeyer could not meet Legolas's eyes, and instead, opted to study her hands, both of which had remained pale. Legolas seated himself noiselessly beside her, contemplating the perfect way to initiate a conversation, but she spoke first. What happened outside of Moria, Legolas? She asked, her voice slightly quavering. I do not remember. You collapsed, he answered simply, but I do not know why. I hope that once we meet the Lady of the Wood, we will find answers. But how did I get here? She asked. If I were unconscious, how? I carried you, Legolas cut in, and Ellenmeyer snapped her head to stare at him. Her mouth fell open slightly, but no words would come out, and she turned away once more. You shouldn't have, she spat. They remained silent, Ellenmeyer concentrating on some unknown spot on the talon, and Legolas studying her weary face. The sound of running water greeted her ears, and she straightened in curiosity. There was a sweet voice infused within it, and she frowned slightly, trying to figure out what it was. The fair Nimrodel, he whispered. She calls to you, does she not? She closed her eyes, as if to focus on the water's gurgling babble. Nimrodel, Ellenmeyer repeated, opening her eyes, revealing the shimmer of unshed tears. Some in Rivendell sing of her, in the Western speech. Yes, he replied, nodding, and softly, he began to sing. Ellenmeyer watched and listened to him as his voice filled her ears, the words sounding oddly different, though she knew the song by heart. Love filled his eyes as their gazes locked, and try as she might, she could not tear her gaze away from his, and her lips trembled. Stop, she urged suddenly, and he broke away from song. She shook her head at his questioning gaze. Nimrodel lost her love, Legolas. Amrith and Nimrodel lost each other. It is not a tale I wish to remember. Not when I still grieve. He reached for her, but she edged back, shaking her head again. Please. Clenching her hands into fists underneath the blanket that covered her, she inhaled sharply before spitting out her next words. Go away, Legolas. You've done enough damage, carrying me here. I will not yield to my attraction to you. Legolas flinched, as if slapped, and he soon shielded his hurt with a sneer. Is that all I ever was to you, Ellenmeyer? He demanded. She would not meet his gaze, nor would she answer him. Beneath the snow on Caradhras, did I not matter to you? Were my words, my hopes all in vain? She turned away and lay down, covering herself almost completely from his view with the warm fur blanket. There is no more hope, Legolas, she whispered. What should we dare to hope for? Love. She let out a bitter laugh. Love does not pass the test of time. Nothing lasts forever, or was that not apparent to you in Khazad-dûm? Gandalf is gone, the ring is growing ever stronger, and the tension in our fellowship is rising. Do you not feel it? What hope have we? Hope is lost to us, much like Nimrodel is to Amrith. She shuddered and pressed her face against the soft pillow beneath her head. I will not give up on you, Legolas declared fiercely, before rising to his feet. Say what you will, but there is still hope, even in all things left unsaid. You are too optimistic for your own good, she sighed, her voice muffled. The higher you dare to hope, the farther you will fall, Legolas. I will not give up on you, he repeated just as fervently, and paused slightly before leaning down and placing a loving kiss in her hair. Her mind protested as her body weakened at the contact. She could not deny that one simple touch from him could provide her with all the warmth she needed, warmth that the blanket she lay under could not give her. She retracted from him, and whimpered. Go. Rest, Melaman, he bid farewell and exited the way he entered, and Ellenmeyer let out another sigh, this one of relief. She could not trust herself in his presence. The wall she had tried to build between them was slowly crumbling before her, but she did not want to succumb to him. Nonetheless, he was right, she needed rest. However, she could still feel eyes watching her, and she sat up quickly, startling a wide-eyed Frodo Baggins. Frodo, you should sleep, she chided in a low voice. You will need your strength. I cannot, he replied, his wide, tortured eyes revealing an inner struggle. The song of Nimrodel haunts me. It is a sad tale, but do not let it trouble you. Then why do you? Taken aback, the she-elf gazed at the young hobbit, but did not know how to reply. Frodo merely studied her for a moment before speaking again. I also see you suffer, Ellenmeyer, Legolas is right. You need your rest, too. It will be a long journey. Ellenmeyer stared in disbelief at the hobbit before her, but he paid no heed as he rolled over on one side and curled into a fetal position, drawing the covers over his small frame. You speak wisely, friend, she whispered. Sleep well. She also lowered herself into her makeshift bed, pulling the covers close. It took only mere seconds before her eyes glazed over with sleep. YRCH. The yell drew Ellenmeyer from her rest, and she was on her feet even before the hobbits next to her struggled with their heavy eyelids. What's going on? Pippin's small voice came from under the heavy covers, and the she-elf was by him in a matter of seconds. They've spotted orcs, she explained in a hushed tone, and Frodo drew a glowing sting from his scabbard as Merry and Pippin sat up abruptly. Sam lay still, shivering underneath his blanket in a quivering lump. Quiet now, Ellenmeyer warned, glancing down to the ground below. They were a long ways up, but she knew that orcs were great climbers. She studied Frodo's blade as it began to fade, but there was some mischief in the air. She could feel it, but she did not know what it was. She turned to Frodo, and the look in his eyes told her he felt exactly the same thing. He shuffled closer to the tree's trunk and peered down through the hole in the talon. Ellenmeyer, I hear something sniffing, he whispered, his voice tinged with fear. Her hand drew to the hilt of her sword and she slowly approached behind Frodo. Get back, she hissed. I see something, he protested, with two glowing eyes. Suddenly Halder appeared, and Ellenmeyer let out a terrified squeak. The elf looked at her in amusement. Did you not sense my approach, my lady? He asked, his voice teasing, though his eyes were worried. I sensed something evil, she answered, narrowing her eyes at him, but he shook his head. It was not I, he replied. I saw a shadowy figure approach the Talon, but it was gone before I could get any closer. What I did see, however, were two large eyes. As did I, Frodo exclaimed, placing Sting back into its sheath. Yes, Halder nodded. It was no orc. My two brothers, Rumel and Orphan, and I led those away into the wood with faint voices. Curse them, they ran through Nimrodal's clear waters with dirtied feet, but they will not leave the woods alive. Orphan has gone ahead to warn our people. But what was that creature in the tree then? Ellenmeyer inquired, glancing at Frodo. I know not, Halder sighed. But it had some skill in climbing. Else would I have thought it were one of you hobbits. Frodo's eyes widened at that, but a realization seemed to dawn on him, for he pressed his lips into a determined line. What shall we do then? He asked. You must take the road south as soon as it is fully light, Halder answered, and with a nod at Ellenmeyer, if the lady is up to it. I fear you must go forward anyway, even if you feel weakened from. I am not weak, she hissed indignantly. I am no helpless elf maiden. I meant no offense, Arwen and Amin, he cut in, his eyes flashing dangerously. I merely said what I did, for you had fallen ill. I spoke with your health in mind. Ellenmeyer felt her cheeks redden and bowed her head to avoid his eyes. I am sorry, she whispered softly. Diola ye, Halder. Thank you, Halder. He waved her apology away with a shake of his head and a wave of his hand. Worry not, he said. Resume your rest, young ones. He settled down beside Ellenmeyer's place on the Talon and sat with his legs crossed, his back straight. She blinked blankly at him. What are you doing? She asked. Someone must watch over all of you, he stated matter-of-factly, giving her a slightly arrogant smirk. She felt her cheeks redden again, but she nodded, and slowly lowered herself onto her covers, feeling self-conscious with the elf watching over them, knowing she could feel his eyes on her. She lay on her side, giving Halder her back, and she smiled in reassurance to Merry and Pippin, who mimicked her movements, though their faces revealed the shock of the news of orcs. A soft devilish lullaby filled the air, and she turned sharply to give Halder a look of surprise before she once again drifted off into a dreamless sleep. She was up ere the sun shone in the pale blue sky, and Halder greeted her with a slight nod. She looked away, terrified of how horrid her morning appearance might appear to the beautiful elf, and her gaze softened as her eyes landed on the four sleeping hobbits. She sat up quickly, running her fingers through the tangled mess that was her hair and straightening her tunic. Umadella, don't worry, Halder spoke, his words halting her movements. Amin Uma Malia. I don't care. Mani. What? Halder sighed and shook his head. You needn't worry about your appearance, Arwen and Amin. It matters not. Her jaw dropped slightly and snapped shut in an instant. What? Can you read minds, Halder? She inquired, the nervousness she felt slowly fading away like the morning mist. He rewarded her with a blinding smile, one full of amusement. No, he answered. The blush that covers your cheeks and the way you avert your eyes indicate your feelings. You are easy to read. He tilted his head to study her. You are young. Her back went rigid. Is that so bad? She demanded, a growl rising from her chest. Nay, your naivete is rather endearing. She was taken aback with his direct reply, unable to absorb his words. She narrowed her eyes at him and looked away, opting instead to rouse the sleeping hobbits from their sleep. She rose to her feet and stretched before she knelt next to Pippin. Awake, Peregrine. An incoherent jumble of words flew from his lips as he turned on his side, not before he unconsciously flung his arm in her direction. Ellenmeyer frowned, crossed her arms and sat back on her heels. Quicker than she deemed possible, Halder was at her side. Allow me, he said quietly, with a smirk. He looked at the sleeping Took's face and whispered one word, food. Immediately, the hobbit's eyes sprang open, as did Merry's and Sam's, and Frodo blinked for a few seconds before he sat up. Ellenmeyer gaped at the hobbits before turning her surprised gaze to Halder. He merely smiled at her before he crossed to the edge of the Talon, letting out a low whistle to the other tree, and an almost identical whistle answered back. Rumel and the others are ready, Halder informed them, and Pippin frowned. Why, it's time for breakfast, he said. Where's? We must continue south, friend, Ellenmeyer answered. After a few minutes of packing and organizing their belongings, they met with the rest of the fellowship on the forest floor by the path, and Halder and Rumel took their place at the front to lead the company forward. Ellenmeyer. A voice greeted her in a strangled tone, and Ellenmeyer whipped around to see Boromir, and his gaze, full of relief and love, was fixed on her. Choking back a sob, She ran into the open arms of her betrothed, burying her face onto his shoulder, and from her position, she did not see the look of triumph the man of Gondor shot in the direction of the Prince of Mirkwood, nor did she catch a glimpse of the icy glare Legolas sent in return. She felt his hands cup her cheeks as he pulled away slightly, but he tilted her face just enough to study it as if to memorize every detail. "Don't you dare worry me again, Ellenmeyer," he whispered fiercely. "My apologies," she answered, the corners of her lips twitching into a smile as she swept away the strands of hair that fell across his eyes and tucked them behind his ears. Just as Boromir leaned down to kiss her, Haldir cleared his throat in annoyance, much to Legolas's relief, and the couple broke free from each other as the warrior of Lorien glared openly at their display of affection. "Follow me," he commanded as he turned away abruptly, and he led the company onto the west side of the Silverlode, following the path a ways southward. Boromir protectively held onto Ellenmeyer's hand, as if afraid to let her go, but his eyes were not keen enough to capture the dark, furtive glances Legolas sent their way, though Ellenmeyer caught them sure enough. Something had happened between the two males while she had been ill, she was sure, but she did not know exactly what it was, but she was in no mood to demand an answer from Boromir right then. It would have to wait until they reached their destination, wherever that would be. Haldir cut through into the trees before abruptly pausing on a bank of the river, and he turned to look at the company. "Across the stream, one of my people awaits," he informed them before he gave a low whistle, and out of the shadows, an elf clad in similar fashion emerged, his hood thrown back to reveal a golden head of perfect hair, much to Ellenmeyer's chagrin. "Is every inhabitant in Lorien so beautiful?" she thought to herself in discomfort, but her thoughts were momentarily interrupted as Haldir skillfully flung a cord of rope to the other side, and his comrade caught it with the greatest ease, tying the cord to a tree as Haldir did the same on the western bank. Much to the amazement of the hobbits, Haldir ran swiftly across the rope to land gracefully on the other end before running back, and Legolas beamed. "I can walk this path," said Legolas, "but the others have not the skill." "Must they swim?" "No," Haldir answered. "We have 2 other ropes to tie just above this one. Those the rest may use to balance themselves to cross to the other side." When this slender bridge was made, the company passed over, some cautiously and slowly, others more easily. Pippin proved the best out of the hobbits, and Ellenmeyer waited on the eastern bank with a congratulatory smile. "Ah, Pippin, you are sure on your feet," she greeted him. "Of course," he answered in mock offense before breaking out into a proud smile. When at length all the company was gathered on the east bank of the Silverlode, the elves untied the ropes and coiled 2 of them. Rummel, who had remained on the other side, drew back the last one, slung it on his shoulder, and with a wave of his hand went away, back to Nimrodel to keep watch. Haldir called their attention. "You have now entered the Nath of the Lorien, or the Gore," he informed them, his tone serious. "We allow no strangers to spy out the secrets of the Nath. Few indeed are even permitted to set foot here." He turned his eyes to Gimli the dwarf, who then shuffled in uneasiness. "Therefore we must blindfold the dwarf. The others may walk free a while until we draw closer to our dwellings." "This agreement was made without my consent," Gimli roared, his eyes ablaze. "I will not walk blindfolded like some prisoner, for I am no spy. I am no more likely to betray you than Legolas, or any other of my companions." There was a note of panic and distress in his voice, and Haldir looked at him wearily. "I do not doubt you," he answered, "but this is our law. I am not the master of this law, nor can I set it aside. I will walk free," Gimli insisted, his face turning red. "Else I will go back and perish alone in the wilderness." "You cannot go back," Haldir hissed. "There are guards now who hide secretly, and you would be slain ere you saw them." Gimli growled and reached for his axe, which Aragorn immediately lay his hand on to stop his movements. "A plague on dwarves and their stiff necks." Legolas sighed, crossing his arms with impatience. "Haldir, please," Mary Sue pleaded, her eyes glancing from the elf to the dwarf. "Try to be reasonable." Gimli wouldn't do anything. "Come," Aragorn said, looking over the company sternly. "Blindfold us all, even Legolas." Gimli let out a hearty laugh. "Ah," he said, grinning widely. "I will be content, if only Legolas here shares my blindness." The Mirkwood prince stood frozen, his mouth agape for a few seconds before he reacted. "I will not," he cried out indignantly, very much like the young elf he was. He clenched his hands in anger. "I am an elf and a kinsman here. Now let us cry, a plague on the stiff necks of elves." Aragorn commented dryly. "I said nothing," Ellenmeyer protested to the ranger, though she shared Legolas's sentiments. Aragorn flashed her a quick apologetic smile before turning back to Haldir, who then nodded and proceeded to blindfold the company. Ellenmeyer watched anxiously as one by one, her companions were deprived of their sight, and when Haldir approached her, she shivered slightly. "Yea, Decile, are you ready?" he asked her softly, and she shook her head fervently. "Amin uma merna ta. I don't want it," she sneered with distaste, and he smirked at her. She did not fight him, however, When he brought the blindfold to her eyes, and satisfied with her silent acquiescence, he tied it securely. Worry not, Arwen Amin, he whispered softly. You will not fall. The path I will lead you on will be clear and free of obstacles. You can trust me. She nodded, trying to calm her nervousness. He smiled fondly at her, though she could not see it, and he moved from her side. The company journeyed well through the day, and not once did a member of the fellowship fall, for Halder remained true to his word and led them on a smooth and soft path. They relaxed and walked on worry-free, trusting in their own senses which had sharpened with the loss of sight. As twilight passed and dusk had fallen, they stopped and rested, but not once did Halder allow them the freedom from their blindfolds, and because they could not see, they did not climb the trees for shelter and remained on the forest floor to rest, and for some, to sleep. They did not become distressed, however, for there was a secure feeling in Lorien, no shadow lay in its lands. The next morning, they journeyed further until midday, when they suddenly heard the melodic voices of elves surrounding them all. Blindfolds came off, and the fellowship delighted in the use of their eyes once more. A marching host of elves have informed me of the lady's commands, Halder explained, his eyes merry. The lady of the Galadrim knows who you all are and bids that you walk free the remainder of the way. He smiled in welcome to the dwarf Gimli. Look and be glad, for you are the first dwarf to behold the trees of the Nath of Lorien since Durin's day. Gimli looked rather pleased with himself as he sat down on the soft grass, content with the new turn of events. Ellenmeyer gasped audibly as she looked up into the left of the open field at which they stood and beheld a great mound where 2 rings of trees stood proudly, the outer ring of leafless, flawless white trees and the inner ring of tall, glorious malorn trees sprinkled with ancient talon. Numerous flowers were scattered about the hill, including the famed yellow Eleanor and pale Nifredel. Saren Amrith. Halder was once again at her side as she gaped at the scenic hill. Once the home to Amrith. Nimrodal's lost love, Ellenmeyer sighed sadly, almost immediately turning away from the sight. It is a beautiful place, far more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. Her gaze fell upon Boromir and then Legolas, both of whom seemed happy at the moment to stare at the world around them. Saren Amrith. 'Tis but another place that proves love lasts not forever. Ellenmeyer's private thoughts were suddenly invaded by an ancient, distant voice. Do not lose hope, young child, the voice urged. The fulfillment of your destiny relies solely on you. A pair of blue eyes flashed in her mind, and Ellenmeyer started, looking wildly this way and that, trying desperately to find the source of the haunting voice. Was she seriously starting to lose her mind? Was she officially going mad? Halder looked at her strangely before he left to show Frodo the beauty of Saren Amrith, and she turned to stare at Boromir and Legolas. Boromir motioned for her to relax with him on the green grass while Legolas watched on with jealousy raging in his eyes, and Mary Sue sat pensively, sadness burdening her pretty features as she studied Legolas's gaze with a heavy heart, knowing fully well with whom his interest lay. You alone will affect their futures, the voice hissed, reverberating through Ellenmeyer's mind, and the she-elf shivered, tearing her gaze away as she settled herself onto the grass with her back to them. I will not, she protested in a voice just above a whisper. I cannot. A hand clasped onto her shoulder, and she yelped suddenly, jumping to her feet as she faced a surprised Boromir. What ails you? He asked, drawing her near, but she stepped out of his embrace and shook her head, and without another word, she fled up toward Saren Amrith. A confession. Boromir remained puzzled as he watched his betrothed flee from him to tackle the gentle slopes of Saren Amrith, and a million thoughts ran through his mind as he tried to figure out what exactly was bothering her. Her elven glow was almost completely gone, and her skin still remained a sickly pale tone. She was fading from him and from the world, and although he could feel it, he was at a loss as to how to even begin to help her. It was a distressing business to feel such helplessness when watching his beloved future wife slowly disintegrate before his very eyes, and the grief he still felt from Gandalf's fall did not help ease his anxiety. Boromir watched as she disappeared between the outer ring of white trees, and he debated whether or not he should go after her and comfort her of whatever she was feeling. Gandalf's fall had definitely hit her the hardest, and he wanted nothing more than to be there for her when she needed him, but if she had wanted to find solace in his embrace, she wouldn't have fled from him the way she did. He sighed and deduced that she needed time to herself, placing aside his need to hold her, to feel the solidity of her love for him in the beating of her heart against his chest. What did you say to her? Boromir whipped around to face a seething Legolas, whose face was growing red with rage. I said nothing to upset her, Boromir growled angrily, his eyes flashing dangerously, and what happens between me and my betrothed is none of your concern. Are you blind, man? Legolas spat. She was obviously disturbed before she ran away to Saren Amrith. But it was none of my doing, Boromir defended, narrowing his eyes. She has been unbalanced since we left Moria, Legolas, and I cannot help but wonder whether or not your meddling has been a cause in all this. Meddling? The elf cried out indignantly. Your comforting her outside of Moria was more than friendly, Boromir sneered. Did you honestly believe that this entire time I could not see the way you look at her, not hear the soft elvish words you speak to her? Do you take me for a fool, elf? Can you not see how happy she is with me? Your desire to force your feelings upon her when she obviously does not return your sentiments does nothing but inflict more stress than she needs already. Boromir was breathing heavily with anger. You had no right to carry her, and when I had insisted on taking on the task, you had no right to declare in front of the entire fellowship that her heart lies not with mine, but with yours. His eyes had grown glassy with unspoken rage, and his hands were clenched, as if he were ready to deliver a blow at any given moment. She is mine, elf. We are betrothed, and you damn well better accept that fact and leave us be. Legolas stood silent as Boromir stalked away, his wrath engulfing the elf as he hung his head in quiet regret. Legolas. He turned around and faced a dispirited Mary Sue. Her large violet eyes were wide with vulnerability, and the golden hue of the wood only enhanced the shine of her wondrous jet black hair. She was beyond stunning, and with her features riddled in melancholy, she could have been an incarnation of Nimrodel herself. Look, I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Boromir. Please. His voice was pained as he looked away from her and moved to leave. I know we made a truce to remain just friends, Legolas, but when I see you hurting that way, I want to help you, Mary Sue said softly, and Legolas paused but did not turn. I know how you feel. Believe me, I do. What do you know of how I feel at the moment? He demanded, a tinge of bitterness lining his words. What can you possibly know of what is going through my mind? She flinched and hesitated before she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that she was risking an even greater broken heart by revealing her feelings now. I know that every time you look at her, your heart skips a beat before beating in a rhythm so fast you can hardly breathe, and yet, you wouldn't give up anything in the world to feel any different, she began, and Legolas started at her description. He slowly faced her as she continued. Every time you see her, you feel your heart cry out with joy, but at the same time, you feel the most repressing sort of pain because you can't be free to run to her and hold her in your arms and whisper the words of love that are dying to be released. She locked her eyes with him, and he saw with surprise that they were rimmed with tears. It pains you every single second because no matter how hard you try, she never ever seems to see what you go through. She doesn't understand what you're willing to endure just to be close to her again. How do you know all this? He asked softly, the agony in his heart making him wince at how exact her account really was. Don't you get it, Legolas? She finally cried out, the tears slipping from her eyes. I know how you feel because I feel the same way. I suffer as you do because I'm in love with you. She recoiled back when the words finally slipped from her mouth, and she was unable to look into his eyes. The silence that lay between them was deafening. What? He finally let out blankly, blinking. I've been in love with you, Legolas, she replied tiredly, still incapable of eye contact, for the longest time. At first, it was because you were so beautiful. No one, absolutely no one I've ever known struck me the way you did when I first saw you. But in Rivendell, when we finally made that truce and became true friends, I realized that I was beginning to fall for more than just your looks. You were always so kind to me, even when I knew I annoyed you at times. You were patient with me, and there were times when you were actually interested in what I had to say, especially when it came to talking about my world. But I was just so frustrated with you. Whenever Ellenmeyer was around, I would catch you looking at her the way I wished you looked at me, and... Her voice trailed off as she sniffed. I got jealous. I had to grab onto you to make you notice me, to get you to stop looking at her. I'd say the rudest things to her in hopes that maybe she'd act so incredibly diabolical that maybe you'd finally look at me favorably. I know you told me before that you always felt so trapped when girls here would relentlessly pursue you, so I tried to tone down my actions a bit, but jealousy makes you do crazy things. She gave a shadow of a smile as he nodded in agreement, thinking back to the way he protectively went to Ellenmeyer the moment she collapsed outside of Moria, denying even Boromir access to her. Words fail me, Legolas muttered, his cheeks flushed at her confession. Her unpleasant attitude suddenly made sense, and as he looked at her, with her beauty emanating from her, he felt his insides constrict. There was no doubt the girl was lovely, but with her confession, she now looked different to him somehow. He could not see her as the whining young child he once thought her to be. All that was a mere visage to how she really was, and it was unnerving. You don't have to say anything, Legolas, she answered, biting her lip. I know I said more than you were ready to hear, but She paused a moment to think. I just want you to be happy, Legolas, and I think you deserve someone who actually sees you and wants to be with you. She shuffled her feet. All I know is that I hate seeing the pain in your eyes every time you look at her. Unrequited feelings are never pleasant. I'm just here for you when you can't talk to anyone else. That's all I wanted to say before I went on a tangent. Her cheeks colored slightly. Right then, she turned to leave, and Legolas felt a lump in his throat. Wait. His voice was strained and hoarse, but when she looked back at him with hope shining in her eyes, his breath caught. He was in love with Ellenmeyer, there was no doubt, but he knew he was not perfect. Mary Sue was beautiful, and with her honest avowal, chasing after Ellenmeyer suddenly became an even more difficult feat to accomplish because the temptation of falling for Mary Sue was now an even more realistic option. He reached his hand to her, and surprise crossed her features, but she took his hand nonetheless. Confrontations in Kara's Galadon. A smile threatened to break free upon her face, but Mary Sue kept it in check, never daring to give in to the tiny shimmer of hope that grew ever stronger the longer she stared into Legolas's eyes. The feel of her tiny hand in his brought her a warmth that she never knew she could feel, and her fingers closed over his as he pulled her close, enveloping her. She sighed and closed her eyes, committing to memory what she was feeling when in his arms. His scent of wood and spice drifted into her nostrils and she inhaled deeply, her senses high on all Legolas could offer her. His soft breath was at her ear, and as her heartbeat quickened, she shivered with delight. Her arms found their way around his waist, and she spent no time at all in conforming the soft curves of her body to the hard planes of his. He drew in a sharp breath and stiffened immediately, and fearing he was going to turn her away, Mary Sue stepped back in alarm, just enough to put space in between them but not too much. Is anything wrong, my love? She whispered softly, and her heart fell when he cringed at the endearment. He pulled away from her, pain clearly written on his face, and she choked back a sob as her body yearned for his warmth. She merely had but a small taste, and she found herself wanting so much more than he offered. Legolas, please. The soft urge in her voice made him flinch again, and this time he looked away from her, and as she reached across the space between them to touch his arm, he quietly moved just out of range. This does not feel right, Mary Sue, he whispered barely loud enough for her to hear. She shook her head at him, but it was useless as he kept his gaze focused on the ground. Maybe you just need to give it time, Legolas, she said, keeping her hope at bay. Please, you just need to get used to the feeling of it. No, he said softly. It has only ever felt right to hold but one person in my arms, and I am sorry, Mary Sue, but you are not the one. Her eyes stung with the burden of salty tears, but she held them back, refusing to give in. No, she hissed menacingly. Legolas, are you listening to yourself? You think you are in love with someone who obviously has issues with herself. Not only that, she's engaged. She promised herself to someone else. Her voice broke off as the first tear fell, and she tried to compose herself before continuing. Legolas looked up, and the pain in his eyes did nothing but cause her flood of tears to stream down her cheeks. She moved toward him, her hands clutching to his tunic in desperation. Legolas, please, what are you doing to me? You've given me hope only to take it back. Why? I do not wish to hurt you even more than I have, Mary Sue, but to believe that a relationship deeper than friendship will come from this will only bring you grief, he answered tiredly. Do not entangle yourself in the mess that has held me prisoner. Break away now while you still have this chance. No, she declared firmly, keeping her eyes focused on his. You will not be rid of me that easily. You will only hurt in the end, he forewarned, stepping away from her once more, wrenching himself from her grasp. I don't believe I will, she said, determination sparkling in her violet eyes, and Legolas grew even more upset with the situation, upset that he could not love the exquisite being in front of him, upset that his heart already belonged to one who seemed not to return his affections. He was tired and angry, and he wanted nothing more than to lash out at someone, anyone to stop the tortuous ache from eating at his soul. Do you want me to say the very words that will break your heart, Mary Sue? He growled suddenly as he grew angry with frustration. She recoiled as if he had slapped her, and she shook her head. You shouldn't have reached for me then, she said quietly before turning to go. I know, he answered, and tears veiled her eyes and blurred her vision as she walked away, and Legolas tore his eyes away from her, turning to gaze at the hill of Saren Amrith, searching for Ellenmeyer's figure amid the foliage. He found her soon enough, but a deep jealousy replaced the frustration that had lingered only seconds before as he watched a conversation unfold between Ellenmeyer and Halder. They sat on a talon, staring off to a place far beyond his field of vision, and he frowned. The crackle of feet treading upon fallen twigs caught his attention, and he averted his gaze to see Sam and Frodo emerge from their venture into Saren Amrith. Immediately, his face became blank and he took on a cheerful smile, his brain working for an excuse to get information from the two hobbits of what Ellenmeyer and Halder were doing so far up in the trees. Was your excursion into Saren Amrith pleasurable, gentlemen? He greeted casually, hoping that sincerity was not lost in his voice. It is far beautiful than any place I have ever walked through, Frodo admitted, but we have yet to enter the city of Kara's Galadon where I am sure the beauty of Saren Amrith will be challenged. Nicest grove of trees I'd ever seen, and this sayin' something, Sam included with a definite nod. Legolas let out a chuckle, looking once more to where Ellenmeyer and Halder sat. And why haven't Halder and Ellenmeyer come back down, I wonder? He inquired indirectly, raising an eyebrow at them and hoping to seem indifferent. Sam shuffled his feet as Frodo shrugged. They did not answer, and with a friendly smile and a nod, the hobbits left him, whispering to themselves, forgetting however, that elves had excellent hearing. I didn't want tear upset, I am or anything, but I suspect that Halder fellow, as a thin for lady, Sam whispered to Frodo. And that isn't a good thing, Frodo commented quietly, stealing a glance to Legolas before looking wearily to Boromir who still sat fuming a few yards away as he rested against the trunk of a Malorn. Legolas's eyes narrowed suspiciously as he caught the tidbits of information, and he crossed his arms. This was becoming far more complicated than he realized, and he glared into the back of Halder's head. I fear he is staring at us, Halder commented quietly, and Ellenmeyer groaned. She folded her legs to her chest, and after tucking her arms under her knees, she placed her chin on top of them. He is becoming too much, she sighed sadly, never removing her stare from the city of Karas Galadon. I don't want to talk about him anymore. It makes my head pound. Halder chuckled and sat down next to her. He studied the she-elf discreetly, watching as the worry lines eased their hold from her face as she admired the city he had called his home for many centuries. Odd, she was. Her face was a sickly pale, and the occasional blush that covered her cheeks only enhanced its gauntness. Her lovely eyes were overshadowed by the dark circles that lay beneath them, and she looked like a shadow of an elf, especially with her elven glow almost completely gone. Granted, she did look much healthier than when they had first come across the fellowship near the Nimrodal, she had looked close to death then. There was a sadness troubling her eyes, and he knew if she did not dispel her misery, she would fade even faster. We do not have to speak of him if that is your wish, he replied, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. He is too irritating, she muttered. He refuses to accept that I am happy with Boromir, and his insistence is slowly driving me more insane than I already am. Halder tilted his head at her in amusement, and the corners of her mouth twitched upward. I'll not mention him from now on. He smirked in reply, obviously not believing her, and she groaned again. Hopeless, aren't I? Just a bit, he answered with a smile, and they said no more as they sat and stared in wonder at the heart of Elvendom in Middle-earth. Even after all these years, it amazes me how marvelous the Golden Wood are, he finally said, breaking their peaceful silence, and as much as I would love to stay here and admire it, we must continue on our journey. The entrance doors do not face northward, and we must head to the southern walls to enter the city. The way is not short by any means. It is time for all of you to meet the Lord Celeborn, and Galadriel, Lady of Light. When they finally rejoined the rest of the fellowship, the members greeted them with refreshed hearts and were eager to head forth into Karas Galadon. Ellenmeyer nodded her head in silent thanks to Halder before turning to move to Boromir's side, and she did not see his lingering gaze as she walked away, though Legolas was quick enough to notice and clenched his fists in response. Almost immediately, Halder snapped his head in his direction, narrowing his eyes in quiet challenge, but naught was said. Without another word, Halder led the group to the gates of the city, and the closer they got, the darker the skies became until they were almost completely under the green canopy of trees. Silver-lighted lamps littered the branches of the trees, and it was an incredulous sight. It was as if the stars of the heavens themselves decided to grace the golden wood with their presence. They came to a white bridge, and Halder looked back to address the group following him. The gates of Karas Galadon, he announced to them, pointing to the tall and strong doors that would greet them at the end of the bridge. They followed him in awe, and when they finally reached the entrance, Halder called out and knocked. The gates swung open soundlessly, allowing them access into the ancient city, and they closed shut behind them. Boromir stiffened visibly, and Ellenmeyer reached her hand to his, and their eyes met, hers pleading with him to stay calm and to trust her kindred. He relaxed a little, but the rigidity never left his body. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion as he looked about uncomfortably, and he gripped her hand almost to the point of pain, but she did not cry out. Silently, they continued, following Halder up a seemingly never-ending stairwell which curved its way around a tall Malorn tree. On a few occasions, they paused to allow the hobbits a quick break to catch their breath, but they never stopped for a long period of time. Feels like we're climbing up Tear Heaven, Pippin sighed heavily, swiping the sweat from his forehead with his tiny cloak. Just breathe, Gimli instructed, leaning on his axe for support. A genuine smile lit up Legolas's face as he grinned at the dwarf, and for a brief moment, he turned and caught Ellenmeyer admiring him with an unguarded expression of love before she started and caught herself, and her face once again became blank and unreadable. She avoided his stare, but that would not stop the mad, vigorous beating of his heart. That is why you mustn't give up hope, he told himself silently. She loves you. You can see it in her eyes. His lips curved upward slightly in a small smile that he kept to himself. They trudged upward until, at last, they reached a wide talon supporting a gorgeous, intimidating house, one that seemed to float from the very branches of the Malorn tree. Each curve and intricate arch conveyed the majesty of Lothlorien, and it was indeed a most fitting house for the Queen of Elves. Halder led them to the base of a wide staircase, and he motioned for them to stay while he moved to the side, his eyes looking upward, and Ellenmeyer followed his gaze. Her jaw immediately dropped open as a pair of figures bathed in radiant white light descended the wide staircase, and she squinted until the light faded to a soft, healthy glow around the couple. There was a crushing pressure on her hand, and after wriggling her fingers, Boromir shot her an apologetic look and loosened but never relinquished his hold. He trembled slightly, and she responded by gently caressing the back of his hand with her thumb. She brought her attention back to the duo, and her eyes were greeted by the sight of the most beautiful pair of elves she had ever seen. There was no doubt in her mind that they were the esteemed Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel, grandparents to her foster brothers and sister, for Arwen certainly received her beauty from the Elven Queen, and Elrohir and Elladan were almost exact duplicates of the Lord Celeborn with the exception of their dark hair. Thoughts of her siblings brought tears to her eyes, and she gaped at the couple, drinking in every detail for they reminded her of the family she terribly missed and left behind. There are yet 11 set out from Rivendell, the Lord Celeborn spoke after a moment of solemn observance of the company. Tell me, where is Gandalf, for I very much desire to speak with him. A tear escaped down Ellenmeyer's cheek, and her lips trembled, wanting to inform him of what had happened, and yet unable to find the strength to speak of a wound still fresh with pain. He has fallen into shadow. The Lady Galadriel stated sorrowfully, her ancient eyes deepening with emotion, and Ellenmeyer stared at her in amazement, a single question forming in her mind: how does she know? It was a Balrog of Morgoth, Legolas answered, quavering slightly, for we went needlessly into the net of Moria. We do not yet know Gandalf's full purpose, she declared, her eyes glowing eerily, and the company fell silent with thought. Is not my voice familiar to you, young one? Ellenmeyer panicked for a moment, unable to place the source of the voice until Galadriel turned her eyes to her and Boromir. The quest stands upon the edge of a knife, she said aloud. Stray but a little and it will fail to the ruin of all. A spasm went through Boromir and Ellenmeyer looked at him in alarm. Suddenly, he was weeping beside his betrothed, turning his face away and covering his eyes with his hands as he wrenched himself away from Ellenmeyer. She slowly reached for him, but the lady interrupted her thoughts once more. Leave him be, child. He needs time to dwell on what I have spoken. It was you who spoke to me near Saren Amrith. Ellenmeyer turned her surprised eyes to the queen, but the lady was focused on Frodo. Her voice once again answered her, though she gave no physical indication of it. Yes, child, it was I. We have much to discuss. Ellenmeyer gave a slight nod in understanding. Hope remains while the company is true, Galadriel stated, smiling softly. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Go now and rest, for you are weary with sorrow and much toil. Tonight you shall sleep in peace. Frodo jumped slightly, startled, and his haunted eyes gazed wearily at the Lady of the Wood. She merely smirked, and, with Lord Celeborn, ascended up the flight of steps once more. They turned to Halder uncertainly, and he nodded and led them down again to the forest floor where awaited them a makeshift canopy. Underneath lay many blankets, and in between the Malorn roots beneath the canopy were large pillows instead of beds. The hobbits' pace quickened until they collapsed onto the pillows, and they each let out sighs of relief. Gimli followed soon after, and immediately, he was asleep. Ellenmeyer studied Boromir as he wandered off a few yards away before planting himself on the ground out of sight behind another Malorn tree. The lady's words still echoed in her head, and she listened, despite the urgency she felt to comfort her betrothed. She sat down beside Merry as Legolas disappeared further into the canopy, and Mary Sue sat down beside her, much to her surprise. You should rest, Ellenmeyer said nonchalantly, though her eyes betrayed her concern for the young human. With one look at Mary Sue's face, it was no mystery that she was troubled, and the she-elf became uncomfortable. They weren't exactly on good terms with each other, but it was indeed peculiar to see Mary Sue and Ellenmeyer not glaring at each other. You're lucky, you know, Mary Sue whispered bitterly, swerving her violet eyes to stare at Ellenmeyer. I honestly don't know what he sees in you. The she-elf looked away. I do not know the answer myself, Ellenmeyer found herself saying, amazed that this was indeed one of the very few moments of civility between the two females. You should rest, she repeated, uncertain as to what to say next. But both froze when Legolas re-emerged, having removed his green tunic to reveal the silver one he wore underneath, and the silver lights from the lamps that hung above danced upon his hair and his face, kissing his chiseled features with affection. Both Mary Sue and Ellenmeyer inhaled sharply in astonishment, turning their attention to the elf as he tilted his head when a melancholic song filled their air. A lament to Gandalf, he informed the company softly, and Ellenmeyer lowered her eyes, unable to take in his exquisite beauty. What do they say about, I am? Mary inquired, lifting his head slightly from his pillow as he looked up into the endless heights of the trees. I have not the heart to tell you, Legolas whispered in response, his voice trembling slightly. For me, the grief is still too near. Mary frowned and lay back down, his eyes closing as he listened softly. Soon, his breathing steadied, and the she-elf knew he had fallen asleep. The song had a melancholy effect. Depression was clear amid their countenances as one by one they each fell into grateful sleep. Ellenmeyer listened as well, feeling her eyes well up once again as the faceless voices continued with their lament, and without her consent, her mind replayed the horrific scene over and over, with Gandalf clinging to the edge of the broken bridge before relinquishing his hold to fall into the dark depths. She bit her lip, trying to force the event out of her head, but the incident would not leave her mind. Out of habit, her body responded the only way it knew how, and she hugged her knees to her chest once more as she rocked back and forth. It did not have to happen that way, she whispered. But it did happen that way, and you must learn to accept it, a voice answered her, and her head snapped up, but she was unable to discern the figure with her blurred vision. She wiped the tears away with the back of her hand as the individual knelt down before her. Things happen for a reason, Ellenmeyer, and although it may not be clear now, it will make sense in. Gandalf did not have to die. She hissed angrily at Haldir. He was my dear friend. She choked back a sob and buried her face against her raised knees. She felt him gently rub her back as if she were a child. She cried silently as she leaned into his touch, and when it was removed a few seconds later, she looked up in dismay at the loss. Life is a precious gift, young one, Haldir said softly. Do not waste yours with too much grief. With that, he gave a small nod before walking away, and Mary Sue looked at his retreating figure and shook her head at Ellenmeyer. I don't get it, the girl said, pulling her lips into a frown. It makes absolutely no sense. What? Ellenmeyer asked blankly, her voice hoarse from her attempt to keep her cries silent. She sniffed and wiped away her remaining tears, but she could not dispel her sadness. The poignant lament of Gandalf's fall still lingered in the air, and her heart twisted with desolation. Are you that blind? Mary Sue gaped at the she-elf in half awe, half disgust. Now you're the one making no sense, Ellenmeyer snarled, laying her head on her knees once more. Stop speaking in riddles. Mary Sue sighed indignantly and nodded her head in Legolas's direction, and Ellenmeyer followed her gaze. His eyes were trained on Haldir's diminishing form with clenched fists. What is wrong with him? She inquired, and Legolas's head swerved at her question, his eyes narrowed. Without another word, he walked into the canopy, never meeting her questioning look. And I thought I was naive. The human girl sighed impatiently, crossing her arms. The only reason I'm saying this is because, her voice trailed off and her cheeks colored, augmenting her natural beauty. Ellenmeyer raised an eyebrow uncertainly. From the beginning, Ellenmeyer, you knew of my feelings for Legolas, Mary Sue muttered, and the she-elf bristled slightly, looking away. If this is another, Legolas is mine, conversation, you needn't bother, she replied. And I do not see what this has to do with Haldir. Gods, woman, are you oblivious to the fact that maybe I am no woman, I am an elf. Fine, elf, are you so ignorant that you can't see that Legolas could possibly be, oh I don't know, jealous maybe, of this growing friendship between you and Haldir? Mary Sue spat in one heated breath, her face growing red with anger. I can't stand the way he pines over you when you obviously don't show that you care about him, so why don't you do all of us a favor and let him know once and for all that he has no chance? Her violet eyes were bulging with fury, and she looked about ready to challenge the she-elf to a duel. I don't need this, Ellenmeyer sneered in turn, angry that Mary Sue could think of nothing other than the object of her affection. Her gray eyes darkened into a stormy cloud of black. Do you not think that I've tried that? Do you honestly think that I want to throw away my chance at a happy marriage with Boromir, the only person who dared to show his love for me? I do not need you to remind me of Legolas's misplaced affections when I am still grieving for the death of one of the only true friends I have ever known. How can you be so selfish, so insensitive to think of nothing but your love life? Don't you dare turn this around to make me look like the insensitive one when you're the one leading 3 guys on. Mary Sue growled, her violet eyes flashing. Especially when one of them happens to be the one I love. Take him then, if it'll shut your mouth, Ellenmeyer snapped, jumping to her feet. Just leave me be. And once again, she fled. Legolas straightened when Ellenmeyer's harsh words drifted into his sensitive ears, and he bowed his head in the shadows as he watched her escape from Mary Sue. Was the look of love he caught on Ellenmeyer's face earlier just his mind's own wishful thinking? Or was it really there, carefully hidden beneath her hard exterior? His heart clamored loudly in his chest, demanding that he find out once and for all, and succumbing, he silently followed her trail. A pair of violet eyes watched on as he ran swiftly after the she-elf, and blinking back her tears, Mary Sue drew her blanket close, attempting to warm herself, but it did not help chase away the terrible coldness she felt surrounding her. The return of the eavesdropping prince. Haldir found Ellenmeyer crouched down below a natural roof of 2 intertwined malorn roots, and the she-elf was shaking with emotion, but with her head bowed, it was difficult to discern what exactly she was feeling. He approached cautiously, not knowing just how to greet her. Go away, she grumbled. Ah, sad then, Halder decided, taking no heed to her words as he crawled under the roots and sat across from her. She made no effort to raise her head in acknowledgement and instead chose to ignore him as she struggled to control her tears. He said nothing and studied the young she-elf until she stilled and grew quiet, and only then did she dare lift her gray eyes to look at him. Ellenmeyer studied the silent elf before her as he watched her with a quiet confidence and wisdom she had only seen among those much older than herself. He intimidated her, he exuded great poise and certainty in all he did, making her feel much younger than she was. And yet, he was patient, never fully demanding her attention and waiting until she was ready to face him. He showed a maturity that reminded her so much of one she missed dearly, her foster father, Lord Elrond, but Halder was far from being a father figure in her eyes. He was also a skilled warrior. She had heard tales of him from her brothers far before she had handled a blade, and it even felt a bit surreal to be sitting across a figure she had heard great stories of from when she had been a small child. What amazed her more was that he chose to sit there with her, a teary mess, until she calmed down. Her eyes locked with his, she was once again amazed by his beauty before Mary Sue's earlier words repeated in her head. Could this great warrior truly be interested in her? Once again, she found herself agreeing with Mary Sue's sentiments. It did not make any sense. A smug smile appeared on his face as he tilted his head under her gaze, knowing fully well that she was observing him. She blushed and turned away. Do I make you uncomfortable, my lady? He questioned, his voice soft. No, I just didn't mean to stare so rudely, she answered, feeling her face grow hot with embarrassment. You're welcome to look, my lady, he said, grinning a bit wider. I shouldn't, she replied sternly, her tone serious. If Mary Sue was right, Ellenmeyer loathed the idea of that, and Halder did have some fascination with her. Ellenmeyer knew she had to stop it before it grew into something bigger. She cringed inwardly at silently admitting that the human girl did make some sense, and it had been that fact alone that caused Ellenmeyer to flee once more. She let out a sigh and shook her head to relieve herself from her thoughts. I understand, Halder said simply, giving a little shrug, but he did not move from his spot, keeping his eyes on her. She squirmed under his gaze, and the corner of his lips twitched slightly in amusement. Why did you follow me? She questioned, drawing her knees to her chest and crossing her arms over them, almost as if to shield herself from him. You seemed distraught, he replied. I did happen to overhear a bit of what had been said between you and Mary Sue, but it was not deliberate. You both were rather loud. There was no pause in his assured speech, and although Ellenmeyer was amazed at his bluntness, she groaned at what he might have heard. So you know of Mary Sue's suspicions then, she said, knowing that with Halder, it would be a waste of time to bother with euphemisms. Yes. He waited quietly, deciding not to elaborate, making it harder for Ellenmeyer to find the right way to ask him of his true feelings. She opened her mouth and closed it again, frowning at her lack of expertise in the art of conversation. So, was all she was able to mutter, cursing under her breath. She shook her head in agitation, silently berating herself for being idiotic, and Halder reached across, placing his hand under her chin to still her movement. Slowly, she looked up into his face, her cheeks coloring slightly. Yes. His eyes softened slightly, but he nodded firmly, answering her silent question. But, why? She stuttered in amazement. Do you mean to tell me that Mary Sue was right? Halder paused a moment as he thought before he gave an answer. Honestly, I was protective at first, he began unabashedly. You were of my kin, and you were near death, and I felt I needed to help you. Of course, I was curious as to how it was possible that one so young could be so disheartened. And because you did share the Talon with Merry and Pippin, they were quick to inform me of their rather biased opinion of you while I tended to your illness. She cracked a small smile and gave a light laugh. What did they say about me? She questioned, curious as to how her tiny friends really viewed her. At first, they threatened to forfeit my life if I did not help revive you, he chuckled, a light twinkling in his eyes. After I reassured them again and again that you would be fine, they wallowed a bit on the fact that you were no hobbit lass and expressed their mild jealousy of your engagement to Boromir. His face grew serious once again, and his eyes searched hers, but for what, she did not know. Your hobbit friends were happy for you, yes, but they also said something was amiss. They said that you might not have thought they would have noticed, but they knew you were not initially pleased, especially when the company arrived in Moria. She looked away guiltily. It was because of Legolas, was it not? She nodded in answer, unable to find the courage to speak the confession aloud. With Merry and Pippin speaking on and on about your bravery, your beauty, Ellenmeyer snorted and muttered quietly, they are blind, honestly. And your compassion, I admit, I became intrigued and wanted to discover as to why such a person with such qualities could be so, for lack of a better word, depressed. And when you finally did regain consciousness, our conversations have always kept my interest, which is saying something. Despite your low view of yourself, you are a captivating creature. She blushed as he grinned again. You do me too much justice, Halder, she protested, shaking her head. You wanted to know, he said innocently, while shooting her a devilish smile. They were silent for a moment, and once again he reached across and caressed her cheek. It did start with my wanting to protect you, I admit, but now, you are by far one of the most interesting creatures I've come upon. I find myself wanting to discover the mysteries you hold, Ellenmeyer. I am nothing more than a plain elf, a warrior, she argued, shaking her head. You mistake me for something more, Halder. Your view of yourself may not be the same as that of those who see you in another light, he answered in response. Remember what I told you before. Your naivete is rather endearing. Halder, please, Ellenmeyer insisted fervently, you mustn't continue with whatever it is you are feeling. If that is your wish, then so be it, he stated quietly. A flash of disappointment darted across his face, but it was gone so quickly, she was sure she had merely imagined it. Do you love Legolas? He asked suddenly, catching her off guard. She started and became silent, her brow furrowing with thought. I remember when I first met him, she began, and I thought he was the most beautiful thing to ever grace Middle-earth. She smiled softly at the memory. I cannot explain what it is when I am with him. He looks at me, and suddenly, I find myself in a trance with no one else in focus but him. But do I love him? She shrugged, suddenly unsure of her exact feelings for him. He compliments me. In areas where I am weak, he is strong, and he looked past this ugly exterior to see me. Did Boromir not do the same thing? Halder cut in. He did, much sooner than Legolas, Ellenmeyer admitted, hiding her face behind her hair when strands fell across it as she ducked her head. With Mary Sue stalking Legolas everywhere he went, I was surprised he even noticed me, but he never showed what he felt until it was too late, and I was with Boromir. And now we're all in this big mess. She sighed and looked up with tired eyes. Which is the only reason why we, too, must avoid any further advancement beyond friendship. Halder took her hand in his, squeezing it softly. Like I said before, I understand, he said with a quiet, sad smile. I will do nothing to jeopardize your relationship with Boromir, or Legolas, if that is your wish. Thank you, Halder, she said, returning his sad smile with one of her own. I'll confess, however, if situations were different, I would have returned your affections 100-fold. The twinkle returned to his eyes. If ever you change your mind, his voice lingered off as he raised a single eyebrow in a questioning arch, but there was mirth in his tone, and they both shared a light laugh. If only things were different, she repeated softly, a wistful look glazing over her eyes. But the circumstances are what they are, and we must do what we must to deal with them properly, he answered, the depth in his eyes and words reflecting his wisdom. Though, a part of me wishes that the situations were indeed different, they openly studied each other, and for a fleeting moment, Ellenmeyer felt the bizarre urge to curse everyone else and throw herself into Halder's arms. Halder was far wiser than both Legolas and Boromir and, with his calming demeanor, was an even better complement to Ellenmeyer's childish impulses and indecisiveness. Without question, she knew he could easily surpass her skills as a warrior, and that was a quality she held in high regard. He cared not for her looks, or lack thereof, he had told her before, and although it might have insulted most of female kind, she embraced his indifference to her appearance with fervor. With growing unease, she realized how much she truly did desire to follow her instinct and bind herself to the elf before her. It would make so much sense to leave Boromir and Legolas behind and find happiness in the woods of Lorien. Her mind became sober as she remembered with a twinge of guilt the reason she was in Lothlorien in the first place, and she scolded herself slightly for the hypocrisy she had committed the moment she accused Mary Sue of being selfish. I really am the selfish one, she thought to herself forlornly, a frown taking hostage of her lips. She tore her eyes away from Halder and furrowed her brow as she scolded herself. I am not here in Lothlorien to find love. I'm here on a quest, bound by a pledge I made to protect the ringbearer and the prophesized one. O holy Valar, Mary Sue was right. I accused her of what I was culpable of the entire time. Tears prickled the corners of her eyes, and Halder started at her sudden change of moods. He leaned closer, gently wiping her tears away, his face full of concern. If you wish to weep, do not hold back, he advised gently. It is best to release your distress than to hold it inside where it may eat at your spirit. Let the sorrow flow free from your system, Ellenmeyer. Find emotional liberation with your tears. When he offered her open arms, she did not resist and collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs. You do not have to be strong at all times, young one, he whispered. I will not judge you. Ellenmeyer began to mumble incoherently into his shoulder as he swayed her in his arms, one of his hands reaching to stroke her hair while the other gently rubbed her back soothingly. He started to hum, and the tone was now familiar as it was the same lullaby he had sung the night when the hobbits and she were startled high upon the Talon by some dark creature with the two bulging eyes. Ellenmeyer found herself comforted by the song and quieted her cries in order to hear Halder's soft, soothing voice drift around her. She felt her heart soar with each rising note, and when the song diminished, she felt her breathing calm down to a steady pace. How long they stayed that way, they did not know, nor did they realize that a certain elven prince had also been watching them for nearly half of that time. Legolas had been concealed behind a root of another malorn tree several yards away, in perfect position to hear everything effortlessly, and the two elves had been so engaged in their conversation that they did not notice as he slipped into hiding. Legolas's eyes were narrowed as he stared at the intimate embrace between the two friends. He wanted to yank her out Halder's arms, and his own limbs tingled with remembrance at how it had felt to hold her the way the Lorien warrior was enfolding her. He inhaled deeply, desperately trying to calm his jealousy. If anything, he knew he had to approach her at least neutrally. He did not want her to run from him as she had before. He knew he would not let her go that willingly again. Unable to take more of the sight of Ellenmeyer in the arms of another, he disclosed his secret hiding spot and stepped out, revealing himself to the two elves, who abruptly pulled apart. He forced his face to remain blank as he walked toward them, even though emotions were battling for control of his features. Legolas. She breathed in surprise, her face an open window to her conflicting feelings. Her gray eyes were wide with shock before they narrowed angrily at his habit of watching her. What? Were you spying on me again? She hissed, and Halder started at this new information. Again, he repeated, turning his suspicious eyes to the Prince of Mirkwood. You've done this before. More than once, Ellenmeyer sneered, crossing her arms heatedly. I apologize, Legolas replied slowly, lowering his eyes from hers only to land on her lips. He gulped, knowing fully well how her lips tasted beneath his, and he longed to taste them again. Please, if I may, I desire to speak with you, Ellenmeyer. I have nothing to say to you, Legolas, she replied flatly, her eyes cold. Then speak not, but listen instead to what I must say, he said slowly, though a hint of panic and pleading could be heard in his undertone. No, she growled emphatically, and Halder stood to block Legolas's way. Do you deny the lady's wishes? He said softly, though the threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Ellenmeyer suddenly looked up fearfully at the growing impatience on Legolas's face. Oh no, she thought in alarm, this isn't what is supposed to happen. Immediately she got up, and placed a hand on Halder's arm, drawing his attention to her. I can handle this, Halder, she whispered gently, her eyes growing soft as she took in the look of protectiveness and concern on his face. But I give you my thanks. His hand covered hers, giving it a tender squeeze. She smiled before turning her gaze to Legolas, who steeled himself as if facing judgment. Fine, she said tiredly. Say what you must, but we will converse in private. She turned back to Halder, and on impulse, she flung herself at him and gave him a tight embrace. Thank you. For everything. She pulled away to catch the look of suffering on Legolas's face, which he immediately removed, and she followed him. They walked in no particular direction, and when they were finally out of Halder's hearing range, Legolas exhaled quietly, stealing glances at the she-elf walking beside him. She was no beauty by any means, but with his odd logic, that was part of why she was beautiful to him. She felt his stare and looked up at him, and the immediate connection was made between them as gray met blue. She blushed fiercely at the obvious love she saw reflecting there and looked away, unable to understand just why he would choose her. What did you want to say to me? She asked, her voice cracking. He reached out his hand to her arm, stopping her in her tracks, and they stood close, facing each other. Immediately, Ellenmeyer took a step back to put more distance between the two of them, and smirking slightly, Legolas took a step forward. Her eyes widened as she backed away, but he continued to advance, ignoring her muffled gasps of protest. Then she could not retreat any farther, for her back made soft contact with the solid bark of a malorn tree, and Legolas closed in on her, his eyes concentrating on nothing else but on the gray of her eyes. I just wanted to say, he began, brushing his lips against her cheek, delighting in her shiver, I love you. She turned her face to the side, blushing fiercely, unaware that the movement exposed the sensitive skin of her neck, just below her ear. Instinctively, Legolas's lips found their way there, and he nuzzled her neck, succeeding in emitting a whimper from her. Legolas, no, she protested weakly, turning her head back to its original position, but now his lips were nearly over hers, and she pressed herself even farther into the tree, as if she were trying to mold herself to it. I heard almost everything, Ellenmeyer, he whispered just against her lips. His hot breath tickled the sensitive skin, and she felt faint, now grateful for his arms around her, for if they hadn't been, she would have surely fallen, weak from desire. What did you hear? She rasped, afraid that if she moved her lips too much, they would come in contact with his, and she knew if he claimed her mouth, she would not have the strength to deny him. You said I complimented you, did you not? He muttered, his eyes turning a dark cerulean shade as his voice grew with intense passion. Her gaze widened, and she looked frightened, unable to vocally confirm it. Instead, she opted for a simple nod, but she dared not move too much for his lips were now nearly on hers. Elbereth, help me, she thought fleetingly. Then why do you fight me? He asked, his voice riddled with pain. Why do you turn me away and deny me when you need me the way I need you? His fingers went to her cheek, tracing soft lines down the curves until his fingertips reached her lips, and she inhaled sharply, her lips tingling with impatience for his. I see it in your eyes, he growled intensely. Answer me, Melaman, why do you deny me? Boromir, she murmured, have you forgotten the simple fact that I am already engaged? Does he make you shiver like that? He snarled in a dangerously low tone as his fingers continued to caress the plump softness of her lips. Do you find yourself drowning in his eyes like this? Oh gods, Legolas, what are you doing to me? Her mind was screaming. Leave me, please, before I do something I'll regret. Her thoughts were interrupted as he did exactly as her thoughts asked, and he stepped away from her so suddenly, she almost fell with shock. Her eyes were wide as she stared at him in disbelief. Why? She stuttered stupidly, suddenly incredibly confused with his actions. He stood before her now a step away, and her body ached with longing, missing the warmth and strength he had provided and had taken away so cruelly. He stared hard at her, his breathing shallow, and yet he kept his arms to his sides, his hands clenched into tight fists. Do you want me? He demanded, and she could only gape at him. Tell me, Ellenmeyer, did you mean what you said when you told Mary Sue to take me away? Her lips trembled as she looked at him, torn as to respond with a liar with the truth. He took half a step closer, and she trembled visibly, wanting to give in to the yearning to confess her true feelings for him and to close the distance between them. Legolas, her voice failed her as she stared up at him in defeat and shrugged helplessly. I leave the choice to you, Mela, he whispered. He spread his arms in an open gesture. These arms are open to you if you so desire to be with me, Ellenmeyer, but you will have to take the first step. I will not force you. Her jaw dropped at him, and she gawked in incredulity. And what if I do not take your offer? She whispered, her voice wavering. He met her gray eyes with his azure ones determinedly. Then I will grant your earlier wish, and go to Mary Sue, he answered with a note of finality. I'll only do what you ask of me. I love you too much to protest. Be you, but why now? She cried out in desperation. Why ask me to make this choice now? I'd rather have closure before the journey becomes too threatening, Ellenmeyer, he sighed tiredly. The dark times ahead will only prove to be too much if we do not settle this while we can. Do you honestly think we can fight to the best of our abilities with this on our minds? He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. You distract me. I cannot even concentrate on the goal of our mission because I've wallowed too much. He lowered his voice to a hiss. Give me peace, in one way or another, Ellenmeyer. I cannot continue on this journey without an answer. He gazed at her imploringly, standing tall in all his glory as an elven prince. What is your decision, Melaman? Interference. What is your decision? Legolas questioned again when she did not answer. Her jaw had dropped slightly, but no sound could be heard from her mouth. She bowed her head, unable to look into his eyes any longer. True to his word, Legolas remained where he was, close enough for her to reach out and kiss him if she desired, but he made no movement whatsoever. The choice was hers and hers alone, and he vowed to remain there as long as he needed until she answered him. Finally, she looked up, locking her gray eyes with his, and although her face remained blank, her eyes were once again the only indicators of the emotions flying crazily in her mind. Very slowly, she felt her hand reach out as though she had no control over it, and Legolas's eyes grew wide, hope flashing wildly across his features. He leaned forward slightly, willing for her fingers to grace his cheek with their touch. She was close, so close. Just as Ellenmeyer opened her mouth to whisper her answer, heavy footsteps alerted the two elves, and to her horror, Boromir strode in their direction, his eyes full of fury. Legolas slowly backed away from Ellenmeyer and steeled himself against the verbal attack that would inevitably ensue. What is going on? Boromir boomed loudly as he reached the pair, and Ellenmeyer gulped, petrified to her spot against the tree. It is night, and you should rest, she started in a quavering voice, but Boromir waved his hand at her attempt to change the subject. I'll find no rest here, he muttered, his eyes flashing with suspicion and pain as he flicked his gaze over her pale face. He snapped his head and glared hatefully at the Prince of Mirkwood. Answer me. The two remained silent, unable to make eye contact, and Ellenmeyer shuffled uncomfortably on her feet. When no one dared to speak for a few minutes, she sighed heavily, keeping her gaze firm on the grass surrounding her feet. How did you know I was here? Ellenmeyer whispered in response, succeeding in angering the man of Gondor even more so than he was. At that moment, gone was the loving man she had known, and in his place stood a man full of rage. She also knew that she could not kiss his pain away this time, her decision had to be made now. I heard the lady's voice, he growled, and she stiffened slightly at the revelation. Galadriel told him of her whereabouts. But why? She led me, and I followed the sound of her voice, only to be greeted with this. He took in a deep shuddering breath. Now, answer me, Ellenmeyer. His voice fell to a soft, dangerous tone. Why are you here? Despite his lowered volume, she flinched at the intensity of his rancor. Steadying her breath, she lifted her eyes to his, frightened of Boromir for the first time. I was brought out here to make a choice, she began slowly, choosing her words carefully, acknowledging that any mistake now could result in a full brawl. What for? Boromir's lip curled up into a sneer, but there was a hint of fear at her words, and he clenched his hands into fists angrily. To choose between the two of you, she uttered, barely audible, and Boromir exploded. Your choice has already been made. He shouted angrily, his eyes flashing at Legolas. Why do you haunt her footsteps, elf? Can you not see she is my betrothed? She does not need you spying her every move. He stalked over to Ellenmeyer's side, his aura threatening as he closed in on her, and her eyes grew wide with open terror. And why does the elf feel that there is even a decision to be made, Ellenmeyer? Why? Tell him of your true feelings, Mela, Legolas cut in, his eyes pleading, and she looked back to Boromir whose face was a mask of pain and anger, daring her to utter one syllable of her betrayal. Back and forth she looked between the two males, her mind screaming insanely in her head as her heart threw an angry tantrum at being denied, and she shut her eyes tightly, covering her ears with her hands. Leave me be, both of you. She cried out, shrinking away from them. Leave me alone. They started at her reaction, and both reached for her, but she swung her arm wildly, succeeding in making contact with the gentle firmness of Legolas's cheek. He straightened, not so much from pain though the blow did throb as Ellenmeyer was no weak female by any means, as from shock. He stood frozen in place, his hand on his cheek as Boromir's attempts to grab a hold of her were also fouled. Why are you acting like this? Boromir growled, his anger finally directed at her. Why do you feel the need to run each and every time I try to find answers from you? You are my betrothed, Ellenmeyer. We do not keep secrets from one another. I do not want to marry you. She spat out finally, the reality of her words sinking in, and Boromir recoiled as if he were the one slapped. Legolas completely forgot about his pain or the fact that she had hit him. He was awaiting anxiously for her to continue, for her to say the words that would be in his favor, but it was a frail hope, for her eyes found his and she growled, Nor do I wish to be with you, Legolas. The sincerity in her tone was unmistakable. You don't love me, Boromir whispered into the air, devoid of any emotion other than shock. This entire time, you did not love. I did, and I still do, Boromir, she cried. Then why this? He asked, his tone flat, his face hardening with uncontrollable pain. Why break free from me if you still love? Because I love Legolas, too, she said in defeat, hanging her head as Legolas snapped his up to gape at her. Mary Sue was right, she continued in a hushed tone. I am a selfish person, and to stay with you would have been nothing but selfish because I would not be able to give all my love to you the way you would give all your love to me. You deserve more than that, Boromir. She turned her eyes to Legolas. And I cannot be with you, Legolas, for the same reason. I need to clear my mind without having to worry about the two of you constantly. Look at us. She spread her arms wide. Look at the three of us, acting like lovesick fools. It is like you said, Legolas. There are more important things to dwell upon. I have worried far too much about my life when the lives of all the free peoples in Middle-earth depend on the success of our mission. It is only right to focus our attention to that cause alone, which is why I release you, Boromir, from your bind to me. Ellenmeyer, despite this argument, I do not want that, he whispered. I still love you, and I do not wish for this to end this way. But I do, she choked, only because I cannot give you what you need. I love you, and a part of me always will, but I cannot deal with a relationship at this moment, not when the burden of our mission demands all of our attention. I'm sorry, Boromir, she sniffed to keep her tears from falling. When this mission ends, maybe my heart will have decided by then, but I cannot give you an answer right now. I will not wait, Boromir snapped without warning, his eyes growing unusually dark and unfamiliar. His words stung her more than she realized, and as her breathing became shallow, her hands flew to her chest over her heart. She sagged against the bark of the tree behind her as realization began to sink into her mind. Boromir had always been a source of strength for her, he had always been by her side throughout it all, and she had become dependent upon it, always firmly believing that he would never leave her side. Now, the actuality of his words burned a hole in her heart, and her knees gave away as she slid down to the forest floor, drawing her knees to her chest once more. She lifted her gaze to stare at Boromir again as he looked completely unaffected by her sudden loss of strength. He suddenly took on the appearance of a stranger, and she blinked again to refocus her eyes. He looked sinister and untrustworthy, but she denied the vision before her. You are not yourself, she whispered, her throat dry. I do not recognize you anymore. You should speak, he scoffed with an empty laugh. Where is the valiant warrior who stole my heart from me? I do not see her here. All that is left of her is a simpering, crying, dreadful mess, a shadow of the one I loved. She never would have betrayed me. With that, Boromir pivoted on his heel and fled the same way he had come, and Legolas stared hard at the crying she-elf huddled at the base of the tree. He kneeled before her, but she buried her face in her hands, refusing to look at him. Go away, she rasped, her voice barely audible. You've heard my decision. All I recall is your declaration of love, Melaman, he answered softly, and now I know why you have kept yourself from me. But you know that I am unstable, she wept, and when he reached for her hand, she did not object, but instead, looked up at him through her blurred vision. Yes, and I will give you time, he replied, placing a loving kiss on her hand. What? She said in confusion, shaking her head uncertainly. Did you not say that you would go to marry Sue? I have heard the words that I have only wished to hear from you alone, he said, placing another gentle kiss on her palm, a gesture that reminded her only too well of her first love, and the tears sprung anew. She pulled her hand away from him, but she did not disconnect her gaze from his. That was the only answer I wished to hear from you. If you are not ready now, then I will wait as long as I have to. A soft smile spread across his face as her eyes filled with unrestricted love, and he leaned in to tenderly place a chaste kiss on her cheek. Until then, I shall not insist on rushing you. She nodded, unable to do anything else, and Legolas took that as his cue to grant her wish and leave her. As he walked away, he resisted the urge to turn back to her, knowing that she needed this time alone to recover from what had just happened. Ellenmeyer watched his retreating figure with her heart beating madly at his response, but it was not enough to keep the pain from swirling in a mad storm inside. The only face in her mind at the moment was that of Boromir's, and she recalled the gentle way he had looked at her when they had shared their first fateful kiss under the willows, the way he was always happy when they spent countless hours in Rivendell with Merry and Pippin. And the vivid memory of how he had taken her into his arms that night of her betrayal after fleeing from her forbidden kiss with Legolas did nothing to stop her from wishing that she had never met the Prince of Mirkwood. And although Boromir had finally relinquished his claim on her, she could not help but wonder at his sudden change in mood. It was as if he had snapped into a different person in the matter of seconds, pleading with her 1 minute not to leave him and then emotionlessly discarding her the next. It made no sense, and she marveled at what could have caused it. She shook her head in disbelief. She was about to refuse Legolas's offer, immediately running to Boromir as soon as the task was complete, but Boromir's sudden appearance changed everything, and now she was left alone once more. Her thoughts turned to Galadriel, and the pain she was feeling quickly transformed to that of bitterness and anger, desperately seeking for any reason at all that the Lady of the Wood might have to have sent Boromir to her at that exact moment in time. It changed absolutely everything, and Ellenmeyer began to blame the wise she-elf. Do not pass judgment just yet, young one, a voice snapped in annoyance in her head, and the young elf jumped to her feet immediately. Look what you have done, my lady. Ellenmeyer whispered harshly into the air, her tears streaming down her face as her head whipped back and forth and up and down, searching for Galadriel. I am no longer engaged to be married, and you have set in motion what the Valar have in store for you, the lady cut in. That is what matters the most. Am I to be alone? She cried out abrasively. Is that what the Valar wish for me? Hush your tongue, young one, Galadriel murmured, and immediately the sight of her angry, ethereal eyes flashed angrily in Ellenmeyer's head, and the she-elf cried out in alarm. Do not be insolent, the lady commanded, her tone calming a bit. Follow my voice for I have much to show you. I care not to see it, Ellenmeyer muttered angrily, crossing her arms. Do you refuse my command when I have been hospitable and allowed your company to enter my wood? Galadriel's voice was threatening, and suddenly, to her left, the lady seemed to have emerged from thin air, and Ellenmeyer shrank back in panic. You often comment on how young the human girl is, and yet, you still act as if you are much younger than she reprimanded. You have been selfish for far too long, Ellenmeyer. This is not about you, but about the future of this very world, and if you wish not to heed my orders, then Middle-earth is lost. I do not want that burden, Ellenmeyer whispered, ashamed. But it is yours to bear, Galadriel replied, her tone and anger softening. Your part is an important one for you must protect both the ringbearer and the one. Your fate has already been written, and you must learn to read the lines. Ellenmeyer bowed her head in humiliation. I am sorry, my lady. Her cheeks were flaming with mortification at her own words and actions, and she silently berated herself. The lady listened to the inner workings of the young she-elf's mind, and she nodded in approval. There was no harsher critic than Ellenmeyer herself. No words the lady could say could hurt worse than the insults flying crazily through Ellenmeyer's brain. It was time for the young she-elf to see the glimpse of the future. Follow me, young one, Galadriel commanded, and this time Ellenmeyer did not fight but abided, and together they walked back toward the city, the mirror of Galadriel and the departure from Lothlorien. Ellenmeyer gulped nervously as Galadriel studied her in complete silence, her eyes dark with quiet anger. Never before had Ellenmeyer ever been so terrified of anyone, and for a fleeting moment, she recalled the day in her father's private study when he had scolded both herself and Mary Sue, but her fear then seemed minute in comparison to the trepidation she was feeling at that very moment. Galadriel had led her to a secluded clearing at the base of an impressively large malorn tree, and in the center resided a sort of well. Galadriel stood across the clearing from her, holding a beautifully simple pitcher, which she calmly filled with the water from a fountain carefully encased between two malorn roots. Silently, the elf queen walked toward the well, pouring the crystal liquid into it, and with a slight nod of her head, beckoned for Ellenmeyer to move forward. Come, child, she spoke, her soft voice laced with a hint of lingering annoyance. What am I to do? Ellenmeyer asked, shrinking away. Galadriel narrowed her eyes, her shoulders raising slightly as she gave a small sigh. Will you look into the mirror? She asked, moving her gaze to the still surface. If it will please you, my lady, Ellenmeyer stammered, and Galadriel's eyes turned an even darker shade of gray. How is it that Elrohir and Eladin were always so quick to inform me of your sharp wit and tongue? Galadriel stated coldly. Where is the warrior they spoke of, for I do not see her here? A surge of anger surged through Ellenmeyer's veins, and she clenched her fists in anger, her eyes flashing at the elf queen. Why do you feel the need to insult me when I have already received enough of it from Boromir today? She growled before she could control herself. I give you my apologies for not being worthy enough a warrior to grace your presence, but I am not, by any means, a weakling. She bit her lip, knowing she had said too much, but to her surprise, the lady smiled softly, unperturbed by Ellenmeyer's outburst. Ah, finally, she answered casually. A hint of your fire, good. It would have disappointed me to see you burst into another fit of tears. Ellenmeyer blushed but kept her gaze steady, her mind silently working overtime to come up with valid reasons as to why the Lady of the Wood was trying to provoke her. Galadriel merely smiled in her mysterious way, reading her thoughts as if they were plainly written across her face. Why, you ask, young one? All this is merely a test, you see. A test for what? Ellenmeyer inquired. Your will must be strong enough to face what is written in your future, Galadriel explained calmly. Emotional weakness is no longer an option, young one. The darkness grows, and you cannot allow yourself to think of anything save what would happen if you should fail. But is my role that important to the cause? Ellenmeyer asked, feeling the burden of the lady's words on her shoulders. Yes. The lady's simple answer baffled the young she-elf into silence, and her eyes landed wearily on the well before her. She then brought her gaze to meet that of the queen before her, who then gave her an encouraging nod. Ellenmeyer approached the well, gripping the circular edge to steady herself, and gathering her courage, she looked down into the silvery water. At first, nothing out of the ordinary appeared, only ripples caressed the calm surface, but as she concentrated, her reflection grew hazy and a soft mist arose, shimmering into an image. Legolas, she choked out as his face appeared clearly, and his eyes locked with hers in a loving glance. His smile spread across his face, and she felt her own lips twitch in response just as his image melted away into that of another. Standing tall with his head held regally was Haldir, and a wave of warmth spread through her as her mouth went dry. He was beautiful to say the least, and without another thought, reached her hand to grace the surface, completely entranced by the look in his eyes. Then, almost as quickly, the water darkened, and Boromir's face replaced that of Haldir's. Ellenmeyer recoiled in alarm, completely taken by surprise at the look that had control of Boromir's features. His wonderful gray eyes were narrowed, shining with the barest hint of malice. The lips that were once adorned with his brilliant smile were now turned down into a dreadful sneer, and Ellenmeyer felt her insides grow cold. There had to be something wrong with Galadriel's mirror, that image was not the Boromir she knew. Before she could even dare to understand the meaning of it all, his image faded away to reveal a dark, looming black gate with warriors strewn at its feet. The only light to illuminate the scene was the fiery redness of the flames that erupted from a source that she was unable to discern for a moment. Her focus turned to a crumpled heap on the bloodied floor. Her eyes widened when she took in the dark hair, the pale skin, and the slightly pointed tips of the ears. Almost as if in slow motion, Legolas walked into the frame, and knelt by the fallen warrior. Blood smeared his tunic as he took the lifeless form into his arms, and tears clung to his cheek. Melaman, he whispered. No, Ellenmeyer gasped, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene that played out before her. Legolas caressed her face, and Ellenmeyer was finally able to see who it was he held in his arms. She could not back away from the well no matter how much her heart protested, for she was held captive by the sight of her own death. Then, a dark shadow loomed over Legolas, but he seemed not to care, clutching in frail hope to Ellenmeyer's body. He said nothing as the Uruk behind him swung an axe down over the couple, and the she-elf finally jerked herself away, suddenly finding it laborious to breathe. Her hand immediately came to rest over her heart and she winced in pain, unable to quench the fear that had suddenly grabbed a hold of her. I know what it is you saw, Galadriel replied, eerily calm, for it is also in my mind. Is this my fate? Ellenmeyer asked, having difficulty in controlling the tremble of her body. We do not yet know, but yes, it is a possibility, she answered. I do not want to die, the younger she-elf whispered, unable to meet Galadriel's gaze. You have time, young one, the Elven Queen reminded her gently, but not much. Follow your instincts, especially those of your heart, and you will find a way. You must learn to believe in yourself, Ellenmeyer. Distractions and doubts will be detrimental to the completion of this mission. She smiled vaguely as she shuffled through Ellenmeyer's thoughts, and the younger she-elf could feel her probing her mind, but was too weary to care. The visions of the mirror weakened her state, and she needed rest and soon. I will do what I must, my lady, she swallowed visibly. But may I go rest? Galadriel cut in, giving Ellenmeyer a soft smile. Remember, young one, the mirror only shows what may happen. Ellenmeyer gave a brief nod, and Galadriel watched in silence as the young she-elf walked away, still trembling slightly at what she had seen. May the Valar help her, Galadriel prayed silently and sighed. An hour or so later, Halder found Ellenmeyer lying on her side at the foot of a malorn, resting her head on a tuft of soft grass with her eyes glazed over with sleep. The camp in which her companions were sleeping was no less than 20 yards away, and Halder deduced that she must have been far too tired to walk the rest of the way. He knew how draining the visions of the mirror could be, and he approached the sleeping she-elf, kneeling by her side. What was it about her that affected him so? She was indeed an odd sort of creature, he concluded, and she had an invisible wall built around her, as if to protect herself from the rest of the world, but inside, he knew she was vulnerable. He knew her tough exterior was merely an act, for was it not just hours ago when he held her crying in his arms? He studied her face, his hand reaching across to caress her cheek, and in her sleep, she shifted slightly, leaning into his touch as her lips curved into a smile. He grinned in response, knowing that she could see him in her sleep if she wanted. He softly removed his hand, and almost immediately, she let out an incoherent protest, but he dared not move. A frown replaced her soft smile, but Halder resisted the urge to hold her. He would not betray his promise to her, and he quietly rose to his feet, willing himself to walk away from her when the glassy look of her eyes faded, and she blinked up at him, just as he turned away. Halder, she whispered, sitting up as he swerved around. Ellenmeyer, he nodded in greeting, not making any sort of attempt to draw closer to her. You must rest. I apologize for disturbing you. His eyes narrowed with concern at the trepidation in her expression. You really weren't disturbing me, she said, her gaze meeting his. No, you must rest, he insisted again. I see it in your eyes. You are tired. Go to sleep. She sat up straighter with indignation, and he sighed in exasperation at her stubbornness. Why aren't you resting? She shot back, crossing her arms, and he shrugged as if the answer were obvious. I am not tired, he replied. You, on the other hand, have been traveling for months, and you still have a ways to go. You must recover your strength. She lowered her eyes, knowing he was right, but it was obvious that something was troubling her. What is it that ails you, Ellenmeyer? The mirror, she whispered. I saw. Her voice drifted off, and she shook her head. Nothing. Halder knew she was lying but decided against questioning her further if she would not give the information freely. He merely nodded, and after pausing for a moment to study her, he turned and walked away, feeling her eyes on him as he moved out of sight. More than ever, confusion clouded her thoughts. The company of 10 would surely leave the next morning, they could not linger any longer than they already have, and yet, Ellenmeyer wanted to stay in the Golden Wood. The region called to her, and her heart yearned for her to relinquish her vow to the Fellowship and stay within the safe walls of Karas Galadon, and maybe, just maybe, staying in the Golden Wood would prevent the horrible vision of her death from coming true. She lay her head back down, shifting until she found a comfortable position. No, she promised to protect the ringbearer with her life, and she was not going to go against her word. No matter how much the Golden Wood pleaded with her to stay, she would not dare forfeit her vow to the Fellowship, but as her eyes followed the path which Halder had followed, her heart sunk and was once again battling with conflicting emotions. I do not know what to do, she whispered into the still night. She sighed, and minutes later, her eyes glazed over as she fell asleep. The next morning, Ellenmeyer had awoken just before the sun's first light, and her energy was restored from her well-deserved rest. She strolled calmly into the camp where the others were just beginning to stir, and Legolas immediately smiled in her direction, but as he remembered his words from the night before, he kept his distance and did not move to greet her in any other fashion. Ellenmeyer smiled back gratefully, though visions of the mirror swam in her mind as soon as she saw him, and immediately she looked away from him, never seeing his lips frown in concern. She shut her eyes momentarily to clear away the images of his misery. It was not her death itself that pained her so, but the expression of loss and hopelessness she had seen on Legolas's face. And she was the cause of it all. Her throat tightened sharply, and she gave a small gasp to clear her airways. There was only one way to prevent Legolas from suffering from her loss if her death was inevitable, but that would only mean she would have to. She shivered slightly before opening her eyes, forcing herself to think no more of it. Her gaze roamed over to Boromir on its own accord, and once more, her throat constricted, making it difficult to breathe. Despite a full night's rest, his face was lined with anxiety, and his eyes reflected a sort of secret madness. When he looked over at her, he sneered in her direction before tearing his gaze away, refusing to acknowledge her presence. Ellenmeyer clamped her jaw together, refusing to allow herself to be affected by his behavior, but despite her outward appearance, she was dying inside, hating the look of contempt that contorted his features. I miss you, Boromir. She wanted to yell at the top of her lungs. I honestly never meant to hurt you. She sighed, knowing that it would be some time before she could approach him again. Keeping her composure, she looked away from her former love and nodded briefly to Aragorn and, a bit awkwardly, she also nodded in greeting to Mary Sue. The young girl mimicked her actions, though she seemed far more subdued than was normal. Her violet eyes strayed from the she-elf and landed on the Mirkwood youth as he carefully polished his blade before replacing it back into its sheath. A pang of guilt riddled Ellenmeyer's heart as she watched the longing fill Mary Sue's eyes. The girl was in love with Legolas, there was no doubt, and she was suffering. It was written plainly across her face, and a sudden revelation hit Ellenmeyer as she studied the human girl. The look on Mary Sue's face was so familiar it filled Ellenmeyer with dread. The roles were now switched, she realized. Her heart hammered with pity for the human girl, and self-hatred burned from within. Ellenmeyer hung her head with guilt, and the urge to strike herself was growing with each passing second. Holy Valar, am I really that much like Mary Sue as she was before? She contemplated silently, drawing her brows together as her thoughts raced through her brain frantically. The idea was disturbing, and after a moment of feeling horribly confused, her mind cleared suddenly as an idea dawned on her. There was one way to end Legolas from suffering in the future as well as putting an end to Mary Sue's distress. She did not enjoy the human girl's company, but Ellenmeyer knew the torture of loving someone who seemed not to have the same feelings, and she felt far worse knowing that she was the reason for Mary Sue's affliction and Legolas's future pain. I am selfish, Ellenmeyer admitted, but no longer. I must do what I can to stop this all. If I have to suffer in the process, then so be it. I am a warrior, I will survive. She looked over to Legolas, and her heart protested slightly at her decision, but if there was any way to prevent his suffering from happening, she was willing to risk it all. A whooping cry broke her free from her thoughts, and her guilt deepened when she saw Merry and Pippin nearly attack an elf who had approached them with food for breakfast. They were a small, insignificant group of people to most of Middle-earth, but hobbits were amazing creatures. They seemed perpetually happy and lived a naturally simple life, and it was definitely not fair that it was one of their own to carry such a heavy burden to rid the world of evil. Ellenmeyer knew she had no time to dwell on her trivial love life. None of it was as important as protecting the one who had vowed to risk his life to save the world. At that moment, Frodo turned his eyes to look at her, and it disturbed her to no end to see his brilliant eyes haunted with the weight of his task. She knew she could not let herself be distracted any further from protecting him. She bound her life to save his, and she would be damned if ever she wallowed in her self-misery again before focusing on the more important things. With that, the load on her shoulders seemed to lighten considerably. I will not think of Legolas nor will Boromir consume my thoughts, she swore to herself. From now until the completion of my task, they will be nothing to me save companions in our mission to protect the Ringbearer. As the she-elf joined her hobbit friends, Galadriel watched her carefully, veiled behind the trees around her, and a slight smile touched her face as she lurked through Ellenmeyer's mental battle, but there was a disturbing shadow within the young she-elf's mind. Does she truly believe she can save Legolas from suffering if she forces him to relinquish his vow to her? Galadriel questioned, troubled at Ellenmeyer's logic. Ah, I have but one more chance to show her her path. Elbereth, help me. After breakfast, the Fellowship of 10 stood at the edge of the Golden Wood, gazing out into the tiny inlet of water, which they knew led out to the great river. They all stood in a row, gazing out in contemplation, none of them wishing to leave the wonderful woods of Lothlorien, but knowing that their departure was inevitable. One by one, they turned away from the water, and the company was silently greeted by a group consisting of 10 elves, including Haldir, whose expression was hard to discern as his gaze locked with Ellenmeyer. Though he wore a small grin on his face, his eyes were troubled, and she tilted her head to the side in question. He gave her a slight shake of his head and looked down at the cloak in his hands. Celeborn appeared behind Haldir and studied each member of the fellowship before he spoke. Never before have we clad strangers in the garb of our own people. Each elf stepped forward to one of the fellowship, and Haldir approached Ellenmeyer slowly. As they locked eyes once more, Halder's lips pulled into a frown, and as he broke visual contact, he wrapped the cloak around her shoulders, securing it with a beautiful green leaf clasp. He swept her hair away from her face, and with a gentle brush of his hand on her cheek, he whispered, Kormaman niuv tena, ta elia yeo, my heart shall weep until it sees thee again. Her breath caught in her throat as the last of his mask fell away and the pain in his eyes finally became visible. Though tears threatened to sprout to her eyes, she kept them at bay, refusing to break down again, but it was difficult keeping her composure, especially when words could not convey exactly how much she was going to miss him. Instead, she impulsively threw her arms about him and held him in a fierce hug, tucking her head just under his chin. At first, he was taken by surprise and did not react, but then she felt his arms wound around her as he buried his face against her hair. However, he pulled away from her quickly, and she let out a cry of protest, but he did not stop to look back at her as he marched away, and she bit her lip to keep from sobbing as his figure diminished into the woods. Mary Sue, who stood to her left, looked up at Ellenmeyer in complete alarm, and then the girl's gaze fell on the Prince of Mirkwood who stood on Ellenmeyer's other side, and his eyes were also on the she-elf, his expression crushed. Ellenmeyer, however, was oblivious to all of it as she kept her gaze steady to the distant trees, and Celeborn continued before anyone could speak. May these cloaks help shield you from unfriendly eyes, he said solemnly, and with a final nod, he turned to Aragorn and took him aside, speaking in hushed, worried tones. What just happened between the two of you? Mary Sue asked Ellenmeyer in a low voice as the she-elf finally looked away from the distance and stared blankly at the girl. He said farewell, she answered. It was more than that, Legolas muttered, and Ellenmeyer swerved around to look at him. There are some things you know nothing about, she said softly, turning away. Like my visions of our deaths. I must set you free if you are to survive this. I know what I saw, he snapped back. He was greeted with silence, and his eyes bore into her, but she refused to glance his way. Ellenmeyer. Stop, she cut in tiredly. Please, just stop. Fine, he snapped, moving away from her, and she sighed heavily just as she caught sight of Galadriel floating towards them in a swan-shaped boat. She gracefully climbed onto shore with two servants behind her, both of whom carried an array of items. As she approached the fellowship, her voice whispered a greeting into Ellenmeyer's mind, and the younger she-elf studied her as she began bestowing gifts to the members of the company. Ellenmeyer, she addressed, I know what it is that troubles you, young one. Did you not pay heed to my words? My lady, I don't want him to hurt as much as he would if I were to die, Ellenmeyer argued with her eyes on Legolas. It is best I force him out now before pain befalls him. Young one, he hurts even now, Galadriel interrupted, approaching the hobbits and Gimli. As her laughter rung into the air at something Gimli had said, the lady continued. You have no control over the emotions he will feel, Ellenmeyer. That is virtually impossible. You are both very young, and the best you can do is to follow your heart, young one. The lady's voice grew quiet in her mind as she wandered through Ellenmeyer's thoughts, and when she finally approached Ellenmeyer, she handed the younger she-elf a simple silver band, fitting it over Ellenmeyer's wrist. When you are in mortal danger, Ellenmeyer, this will aid you and give you strength, revealing your true identity. Do not give up hope. My true identity, she repeated in confusion, only to be rewarded with Galadriel's mysterious smile. Time, my dear, she said. Only time will tell. As Ellenmeyer looked down to study the silver wristlet, she caught sight of a piece of parchment in her hand, and Galadriel's voice entered her mind once more. He is waiting for you. Her head snapped up in confusion, but Galadriel continued on to Mary Sue, to whom she handed a beautifully carved dagger in a leather sheath adorned with gold embroidery. Discreetly, Ellenmeyer unfolded the small parchment, reading the hastily written message that simply said, This was where I held you when you cried. Meet me there once more. There was no signature, but she knew exactly who wrote it and where to meet, and when the gift-giving was over, Legolas, Boromir, and Aragorn moved to pack the boats with supplies. Ellenmeyer glanced back and forth across the fellowship and whispered urgently to Mary Sue who idly stood beside her. I've forgotten something, she said in a hushed tone, and Mary Sue's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What was it? She asked. I must go back to get it, Ellenmeyer continued. I won't be long, but if anyone inquires. What did you forget? Mary Sue questioned insistently, but Ellenmeyer turned and fled back into the woods, darting through bushes and around trees, just as Galadriel's voice whispered in her mind, Remember my words, young one. It will be some time before you hear my advice once more. Her voice faded as Ellenmeyer reached her destination. Her heart was pounding wildly from the adrenaline rushing through her veins as she approached the Malorn tree with a natural shelter formed from two of its roots. She was suddenly unsure of her hasty decision to flee to him at the last moment, but when she ducked down to enter the shelter, all doubts washed away as Halder turned to her, his eyes shining brightly. I was uncertain as to whether or not you would read the parchment I had left in your hand when I left, he greeted, holding his hand out to her. She took it, and he drew her close, embracing her again. It was far too difficult for me to say my goodbye with the fellowship watching. I understand, Halder, but I cannot tarry, Ellenmeyer whispered. I must go. The fellowship must leave. I know. He released her, but they remained close, and he cupped her face in his hands. You must be careful, Ellenmeyer. I will, she said with a nod, and gulped when her eyes grew misty. If only I could stay. You made a vow, and you must keep it. I will, she repeated. He placed a kiss on her forehead before he pulled something out of his pocket, and she looked down into his hands. What is that? My gift to you, he said, and taking her hand, he slipped a simple silver band onto the index finger of her right hand and placed a kiss on it. I've worn it during battles, and I give it to you now to keep you safe. The ring shrunk down to fit her finger, and she stared at it, completely bewildered. Halder, I cannot. It is a gift, Ellenmeyer, he whispered. Amin harmuva onal e, Cormaman, I shall treasure your gift in my heart, she choked, and he chuckled, leaning in. You had better, he muttered, caressing her face once more. Ellenmeyer, I'm well aware that I promised otherwise, but forgive me if I want to. He cut himself off as he placed his lips on hers, and she knew she should have pushed him away, but she could not deny how he made her feel, how he made her react, and instead of pulling free, her arms went around him and clutched him tightly against her. Bolts of electricity shocked her heart into spasms as he grinned against her lips and nipped playfully at her bottom lip. Their kiss deepened until Ellenmeyer finally pulled away, locking her eyes with his. I must go, she whispered, and on instinct, she added, I promise I will come back to you. Ellenmeyer, you still have a journey ahead of you, he replied huskily, his eyes darkening with emotion. We do not know what may happen. Please do not make a promise that may not be fulfilled. When she looked away, hurt and embarrassed, he lifted her chin with his hand. I will, however, pray to the Valar that you do come back to me. He kissed her softly. Go now, Ellenmeyer, before I cannot let you. She nodded, and with one last glance, she fled back down the path she had come, and Halder slowly emerged from the shelter, watching her fade away. You will see her sooner than you expect, Galadriel's voice said, penetrating through his thoughts. My lady, with her decision to see you one last time, a new path is now laid before her, she continued, and also before you. What do you see, my lady? There will be danger in store for the both of you, Halder. Her voice faded away and left him with his troubled thoughts. Ellenmeyer reached the boats just as the last of the hobbits carefully climbed into them, and Aragorn motioned for her to get into the last boat, and she groaned inwardly when she realized she was stuck with Mary Sue. Keeping her composure, she approached the boat where the girl impatiently gazed up at her. Did you find it? She asked Ellenmeyer while handing her an oar. Find what? Ellenmeyer asked blankly, looking over at the other boats, her eyes landing guilty on Legolas and then on Boromir. She looked back down on her hand where the ring shone brightly, happily hugging her finger. She was suddenly filled with a sense of calm and purpose, and she could only guess that it was Halder's influence. She smiled slightly, savoring the feeling that had begun to creep over her, but she couldn't identify exactly what it was. Well, obviously that, muttered Mary Sue, whose eyes grew wide as she caught sight of the ring. Did Legolas give that to you? The pain in her voice was obvious, and Ellenmeyer shook her head, knowing that it had been her past choices that had given Mary Sue distress. She was going to right that wrong, she decided, adjusting the ring on her finger. No, there is nothing between Legolas and I, Ellenmeyer said softly, as she rowed the boat behind the three in front of her. There is only friendship. She lowered her voice, knowing that it was time to admit what had been plaguing her. There is something I must admit if we are to work together, Mary Sue. The girl perked up and looked back at her in interest. What is it? You were right. What? That night, when you said I was insensitive, Ellenmeyer said and sighed. I've taken the time to reflect, especially after a discussion I had with Galadriel. And, I admit, I really have not been fair, but now. She rowed forward easily, and as they sailed by the edge of the forest, a solitary figure stood there, staring at her with one hand raised in farewell. Mary Sue followed her gaze and saw Halder before she looked back at Ellenmeyer, and the she-elf stared back at the other elf in awe. I've made my decision. Ellenmeyer tore her eyes away from him when he stepped out of sight. So, you mean to say, Legolas and you? Mary Sue let her voice trail off hopefully, and Ellenmeyer forced a smile on her face. This is the only way to keep him from death, she repeated over and over in her head. There will be nothing between us, she answered more confidently than she felt, and if you truly want him, then I will help you. All Mary Sue could do was gawk in disbelief. Really? Ellenmeyer merely nodded in reply, else words would have streamed from her mouth to take back her offer, and she turned away from Mary Sue, concentrating hard on her rowing as the girl smiled in pure giddiness. She shot a quick glance at Legolas and Gimli's boat where Legolas was smiling at something that Gimli had said. I set you free, love. The breaking of the fellowship. Legolas knew immediately that something had happened with Ellenmeyer the first time Aragorn had directed them to shore to rest. There was a cold, distant air about her, and he wondered whether he should keep to his promise and stay away from her, or whether he should run to her and ask her what was burdening her so. He couldn't, for the life of him, figure it out as the company carefully organized their camp, but, even in the fading light of day, a tiny shimmer of reflected light caught his elvish eyes, and he looked down in shock at the tiny ring that enveloped Ellenmeyer's finger. She had never worn such jewelry before, and a spasm of pain immediately rushed to his heart as his mind jumped to the many conclusions of what could have surpassed in the very little time they had had before their departure in Lothlorien. His mind flashed back to her unusual behavior when they had begun their packing of the boats before their leaving, and he had barely enough time to register her fleeting figure as she had fled back through the Golden Wood, leaving a gaping Mary Sue behind. He had awaited her return, watching her discreetly as she had run back to the river bank with her cheeks flushed, but there was a difference in her aura. The distress that had consumed her with Gandalf's fall was still there, but there was also an acceptance and a sense of peace. Her gray eyes were calm like the skies after a terrible storm, and she held her head high with more confidence in a manner much like. No, he said quietly to himself as his eyes narrowed in her direction. Haldir, he thought questioningly to himself. Ellenmeyer's relationship to Haldir was much more comfortable than Legolas would have liked, but, a ring. A ring could only symbolize one thing between two people, but surely Ellenmeyer she wouldn't have, would she? The question repeated itself within the confines of his mind, and what scared him even more was that he hadn't a clue of what the answer would be. A familiar anger arose in his chest, and he forced his eyes away from her, clenching his jaw shut. Images of Ellenmeyer's goodbye to Haldir at the gift-giving resurfaced in his mind as did the jealousy and hurt he had felt then. Is she even worth this pain? He thought silently, as he sat by the small fire that the hobbits were building. His eyes were drawn to the flames as he thought of his relationship with the she-elf, and although he had told her that hearing her declaration of love had been more than enough for him, he wasn't exactly quite sure anymore. Because of her, he had suffered more than he would have liked, and she had distracted his mind away from their mission more than enough times. He risked a glance in her direction as she approached the fire as well, and he snapped his gaze away instantly, gulping down the bitter taste of betrayal he was feeling. He told her that he would wait for her until she was ready, but the ring on her finger signified that she had been ready for someone to love for some time. Maybe, his breaking heart thought dismally, he wasn't the one meant for her after all. If their fates were truly intertwined, she wouldn't have been wearing the ring of another. Restraining the fury that threatened to break free, Legolas regarded her coolly with his eyes, acknowledging her presence, and much to his dismay, she did exactly the same with an attitude slightly colder than he thought possible from her. His brows furrowed together as he looked away from her, focusing his gaze on the fire before them, his ears desperately grabbing onto the cheerful, though quiet, chatter of the hobbits. As much as he wanted a distraction at that moment, he couldn't keep his thoughts of Ellenmeyer away, and he stared in her direction once more. He knew just by looking at her that she was once again as emotionally distant from him as she had been when they had first met. He sighed inwardly, knowing that to draw her back to him would take another strong effort of patience on his part, and though his logical mind scoffed at the idea of putting up with her any longer, he could not keep his heart from taking the challenge. He loved her, he could never ever deny that fact, but was his love for her enough to keep them together? His dismal thoughts reflected in the blue of his eyes as he stared at the carefully composed she-elf, and she flicked her eyes to quickly look at him before turning her attention to the fire. What is it? She asked calmly, never taking her eyes away from the flickering flames. Something troubles you. Your ring, he answered truthfully, hoping that maybe he could reach her through his honesty. It is Haldir's, she replied bluntly, and he winced at the detachment she held in her tone. A present, he said. A good luck charm, more like. Is that all it represents? He asked, surprised at the bitterness that reeked in his voice, and Ellenmeyer tore her eyes away from the blaze to stare at him, confusion clearly written on her face. Of course, she said steadily, though with not much confidence. If he had intended it to mean something of another nature, he would have told me. But would you have accepted it all the same? Legolas fired at her, before guilt settled in the pit of his stomach at her hurt expression, and she stood abruptly. Please, do not make this harder than it should be, she said over her shoulder as she turned on her heel and walked away. Why is she saying all that? He muttered to himself as he also remembered her cryptic words at the gift-giving. There are some things you know nothing about, she had said to him then, and although he had retorted back in anger, he could not help the chill that had taken a hold of him at her words. Hey, a voice greeted him hesitantly, and he looked up to see Mary Sue standing there, and she motioned to the space next to him. Is anyone sitting there? No, but there are other seats available, he said brusquely, and after a moment of indecision, he stood up. As a matter of fact, you can take my seat. As she sputtered for words, Legolas left her standing alone, and just as she moved to follow him, the hobbits, satisfied with the fire that they had built, grabbed a hold of her and started a friendly conversation, and with a forced smile, she reluctantly joined them. Legolas let out a sigh of relief, and he moved toward the shore, where Aragorn and Boromir stood, but he paused slightly before he reached the two men. They were in an argument of sorts, and silently, another person drew up next to the elf as they watched them exchange heated words. Something is amiss with that Boromir, Gimli muttered. Ever since Lothlorien, he had been acting quite strange. Legolas did nothing but nod, choosing not to comment. Together they watched the two men before Aragorn stormed away from Boromir, who had then sat abruptly at the spot in which he was standing, breathing deeply as if to calm himself. Several more days and nights passed, and the group of 10 continued down the great river, and though no more words were exchanged between Legolas and Elendmire, the silence between the two only increased the tension within the company. After the fight between the two men, Aragorn and Boromir hardly spoke to one another unless it was absolutely dire for them to do so. The strain was taking its toll the most on the hobbits, especially Frodo, who now seemed more troubled than ever, but everyone within the fellowship felt the heavy weight of the growing anxiety. Deep within their hearts, each member knew that they would not last together for very long. It was inevitable, they all knew, that something was going to break their fellowship, and that thought placed a heavy burden on their shoulders as they awaited for that dreadfully fated day. Who is keeping watch? Legolas questioned one night when they had taken to shore after a long day's work of rowing. The elven lass, the dwarf answered, amused at the affect his words had on the elf. It's quite lonely, isn't it? Keeping watch by oneself. She should be used to it by now, the way she pushes everyone away, Legolas returned, anger dribbling from his words, surprising even himself at how livid he sounded. Gimli merely grunted, not wanting to infuriate the elf further. Forgive me, Legolas muttered moments later. I am not in the best disposition. It's more than obvious that the group harmony is out of balance, Gimli commented, shaking his head before turning to go to the fire where most of the fellowship had gathered. He paused and looked back at Legolas. And lad, talk to her. No good can come from hiding your emotions. With that, the dwarf joined the company at the fire, and sighing, Legolas silently debated over the dwarf's words before coming to a conclusion, and without another moment's hesitation, he followed a path of footsteps just along the riverbank before it cut sharply toward an incline covered with green growth. He walked easily up the incline to find a small group of boulders, perfect for sitting and keeping watch over the fellowship and the surrounding areas. There sat Elendmire, gazing over the rest of the company, and she let out an audible sigh, as if she desired nothing more than to be with the group instead being alone watching over them. She turned her head snappishly, immediately spotting Legolas standing behind her. I meant not to sneak up on you, he said before she could speak. It is a goal of mine to break bad habits. A corner of her mouth lifted, spreading a small grin on her lips, and Legolas walked toward her, sitting himself down beside her. I saw you heading this way, she informed him matter-of-factly. Not much escapes my vision from here, so your coming technically did not surprise me in the least. Ah, a silence fell over them, and they both observed the scene below where Sam and Pippin were in the middle of telling a story, one which held the rest of their companions engrossed, save for one person. Boromir still sat away from the others, keeping his gaze on the river, and Elendmire frowned at him, sadness etching the lines on her face. You miss him, do you not? Legolas supplied, reading the emotions in her eyes. She stiffened, automatically straightening her back, and she bent her legs, as if to leave, but Legolas, much quicker than she, grabbed a hold of her arm, freezing her motion. Talk to me, Elendmire. There is nothing to discuss between us, she retorted, though she settled back down on the ground, her head bowed. There needs to be clarification, Legolas began, looking at her expectantly, but she merely stared at him in confusion. Then speak, if you must. I had rather hoped you would clarify your position in this relationship, if you will. Legolas immediately detected the tension in her body as she gazed at him wearily. What is there to explain to you, Legolas? Elendmire questioned quietly, returning her gaze to Boromir. I have already told you of how I felt, and I had thought you would let the matter rest. Quote, your actions have given me reason to doubt your earlier declaration, he stated, gesturing to her ring. You said you loved me. You also said that you could not be with anyone, especially when you were torn between Boromir and I, and yet, there is physical evidence wrapped around your finger that indicates otherwise. Honestly, what do you want with me, Elendmire? The anger that he had felt toward her did not arise somehow, now that he was speaking to her in a civil manner. He took in her haggard appearance, her weary expression, and his heart softened. His love shone brightly in the depths of his eyes, and even in the darkness of the fading twilight, Elendmire could feel her heart hammering in her chest the way it always did when Legolas was near. Forcing herself away from him was one of the hardest things she had ever had to do, but being so close to him now nearly broke her resolve, and she was slipping away from the facade she had kept up since they had departed from the shores of Lothlorien. He was so close, only mere inches away, and all she had to do was close the gap between them and fall into his arms. All she had to do was apologize to him for hurting him the way she obviously had from the moment they had met, and all she had to do was give in to the fact that she missed him. All she had to do was believe that perhaps, the love between them was stronger than she thought possible, and maybe the love that she was so scared of could actually survive the evil they were going to face. All she had to do was believe. Then, flashes of her vision in Galadriel's mirror erupted into her thoughts, and she recoiled from him, shaken at her remembrance of his mangled body lying on top of her dead corpse. No, she thought to herself. No, being together will only invite death. Legolas, I cannot say what, why, she stuttered, successfully confusing him even more. What? His oceanic blue eyes clouded with worry, and placed both hands on her shoulders to placate her, but she jerked out of his reach, as if his touch burned her. Being with me will only cause you more pain, she finally blurted out, and he started at her words. I do not want to put you through more pain than you are feeling now, and being with me will only do so. Why are you speaking so enigmatically? Legolas demanded, but before he could get more out of her, her emotions were once again hidden deep within her, and he knew that once she had reached this point, it was nearly impossible for him to get more from her. Her face had faded into a protective mask, and she coolly straightened her shoulders as she flicked her messy braid over her shoulder. I am on duty here, Legolas, she stated, moving back into the original position he had found her in. She faced away from him, gazing over the fellowship. But, please. With that, she fell silent, and frustrated, Legolas stormed away, his pent-up aggravation threatening once again to break free, but a mysterious presence chilled away any emotion save that of fear, and he immediately stared up into the sky, as if expecting something to hover above, but nothing except the twinkling of the stars greeted his tired eyes. He scanned the skies, but no matter how hard he searched, all seemed normal. However, the elf could not shake the feeling away, and he looked back at Ellenmire, only to see her gazing up into the heavens as well. Their eyes met, and even with the distance between them, both knew that they had to put aside their quarrels. Danger was approaching them at a rapid pace, and they felt it within the very cores of their spirits. They had to be ready. Legolas rushed down to where the others were, still peering into the sky as if trying to coax the heavens to reveal the presence he was itching to destroy. Aragorn immediately noticed Legolas's odd behavior, and he turned his gaze upwards. Legolas, what is it? Aragorn called out to him in a hushed tone. Is something amiss? Something lingers in the air, Legolas said, motioning for Gimli to gather the hobbits into the safety of the shadows. There is evil. Can you sense it? Aragorn nodded, his gaze never swaying from his upward observation, and as if on cue, a large dark body flew from the south and blocked the starlight from those watching below, its large wings flapping noiselessly in the air. From somewhere across the water, snarls and growls greeted the dark creature, and chills ran throughout the entire company as the blackness descended upon them. Frodo gasped when the wound on his shoulder burned as if the creature's presence had reopened the gash, and Sam's worried eyes flashed in his direction as his master's shaky hand grasped his cloak to endure the pain. Ellenmire raised an unsteady arm as she took aim with her bow, and her breathing was shallow as she tried futilely to release the arrow she had ready, but without the comfort of light, she felt her fear take over her. Just as she brought her hand down to calm herself, the great bow of Lorien sang through the night as Legolas fearlessly shot the winged beast, and a shrill groan escaped its terrible mouth as it fell out of the air, vanishing down into the gloom of the eastern shore. As quickly as it had come, it was gone, and the moon and stars twinkled brightly down at them, greeting them with their light. The loud voices that had welcomed the creature were now silenced, but for the rest of the night, the fellowship was unable to relax enough to let their guard down. A few hours later, after Gimli had traded places with him to keep watch, Legolas made his way back down to the camp to find them all sleeping, save one person. Ellenmire sat quietly, though her shoulders were heaving, as if she were silently sobbing to herself. Making no noise whatsoever, Legolas crept toward her and could make out her cursing to herself as she whimpered, her shadow dancing with her movements. You are a coward, Ellenmire. She hissed to herself in a small voice, that no one, save elves, would be able to hear. The fire cackled in response, and a slight breeze blew against her face, as if to console her. The company was in danger, and yet, like a coward, you could not do anything, and you call yourself a warrior. She stifled a cough as she wiped her tears away. Once again, all you can do is cry. You're nothing but a shameless, useless coward. What good are you to the fellowship if you cannot even protect them? Boromir was right in leaving you. You don't deserve him, or Legolas, or Haldir, or anyone. Legolas gulped down the lump that had formed in his throat as he listened to her, and although he was still angry with her, hearing her piteous wallowing enraged him even more. Is this why she keeps herself from me? He questioned himself as she continued on her self-degradation. She still thinks that she is not worthy of my affections. But, she whispered in a strangely calm tone that grabbed his attention, it is right that I do not deserve them, especially Legolas. I will only cause his death. Legolas bit hard on his lip to prevent the surprise from escaping through his mouth, as I had seen in the mirror. He will die if I get too close. A new onslaught of tears rolled down her cheeks as she winced in pain and closed her eyes, and Legolas realized with a start that Galadriel had shown her a glimpse of their future together, or rather, lack thereof. Curse it all, he thought angrily. If I die, so be it, but do not bear this pain alone, Ellenmeyer. I will not allow it. So that was your purpose in keeping away from me, he stated, as he stepped towards her, and she stiffened immediately, rose to her feet, and spun around to gape at him. How much did you hear? Enough to know why. Do not come closer, I beg of you, she pleaded, backing away from him as she dried her tears with the sleeve of her tunic. My words were not meant for you to hear. Nevertheless, I heard them, he said evenly, though his eyes were ablaze with anger. If my death is inevitable, then so be it, but stop this nonsense right now. Though his voice was barely above that of a whisper, she flinched as if he had been bellowing at the top of his lungs. I do not want you to die. Do you not understand that? And yet, you kill a bit of me each day by acting the way you do you not understand that? He shot back, knowing that his sharp words sliced deeply into her, but she needed to hear them just as much as he needed to say them. I have not had the privilege, or curse if you see it that way, of viewing into Galadriel's mirror, but if my life's end is near, then I would rather share my remaining time with you. But you will surely die. Then let me die, he muttered fervently. My fate is my fate. If I am to walk my last upon this land within the next season, then it is my choice to do what I wish. You cannot choose for me. He was breathing heavily as he sped to her side, engulfing her in his arms, and at first, she fought him, but he wouldn't relent his hold on her. With one final, futile attempt, she collapsed against him, sobbing into his tunic. You do not have to be strong at all times, he whispered into her ear as his hands traced comforting circles on her back. His anger slowly subsided, the sensation of having her in his arms once again weakening him. Why? She croaked at him in between her cries. No matter how horrible my attitude is toward you, no matter how weak I am, why do you not leave me? I do not know, he replied truthfully, furrowing his brow as he searched for an answer. I am just as stubborn as you, I suppose. But, Halder, she sniffed pathetically. You love him, then. Legolas braced himself for the worst as he awaited the words that would surely cause him more grief. I know not, she sighed heavily. Confusion seems to be my best friend as of late. There was a barest hint of wistfulness in her tone as her thoughts flew to the elf she had left behind in Lothlorien, and it was not lost upon Legolas. Even her body language spoke volumes as her shoulders relaxed at the thought of Halder, and Legolas suppressed the need to growl in frustration. The answer is obvious enough, he stated evenly, unwrapping his arms from her, and was disappointed to see the strength regaining in her composure, but he forced a tiny smile onto his face. He means much to you if even the smallest thought of him can calm you in ways I cannot. I suppose you're right, she said softly, and Legolas kept his expression blank, though his hand itched to slap her for toying with him, even if she did not know she did so. Then I bid you good night. He fled away from her, despite her cry of protest, and he hid within the dark shadows of the trees as she mechanically sat back down in front of the dying embers. Both elves cried silent tears of regret, knowing that what had surpassed felt very much like a goodbye. So much for re-establishing the group harmony, Legolas thought bitterly to himself as the fellowship continued to row down the great river the next day. His last encounter with Ellenmeyer not only made him rather uncomfortable, he was also the subject of minor scrutiny when Mary Sue lovingly pointed out to the rest of the company that he was paler than was normal for him, and the worried glances shot his way succeeded in bothering him even more. The threatening growls on the eastern side of the river also did nothing to calm his nerves. Gimli, the only one who seemed to sense the elf's anxiety, commented on nothing else save the enemies that littered the east, and for that, Legolas was grateful. As they rode toward a bend in the river, the sound of crashing water grew louder that even the hobbits strained their necks to stare ahead, wondering where exactly the sound was coming from. As they rounded the bend a few minutes later, all 10 pairs of eyes widened at the sight before them. 2 massive stone figures guarded each side of the river, staring almost menacingly at those who dared to enter their land. They each held up a huge, majestic hand, as their robes fell around them in intimidating cascades of stone. Ellenmeyer's mouth dropped slightly in amazement, taken aback at how small and insignificant she suddenly felt under their shadows. The Argonath, Aragorn whispered in awe from his boat, though her elven ears caught them. The kings of old, my kin. Ellenmeyer started at the information as the imposing statues kept her attention, and Mary Sue had to tug on her sleeve to keep the she-elf from losing her focus on rowing their boat. Her cheeks flushing, Ellenmeyer realized that they had fallen behind the group because of her gawking, and she quickly set her mind to the task at hand, though, with a pang of regret, wished that she had been able to observe such an amazing sight when not on dire mission. It was not until they were quite a distance away from the Argonath that Aragorn led them to shore, and it was only then did Ellenmeyer realize how far they had actually traveled when her eyes focused on the heavy mist that floated just over the other end of the river. "Where's that lead to?" Mary Sue asked her, staring in the same general direction. "Do you hear the sound?" The she-elf questioned, tilting her head in challenge. "It is that of a huge waterfall. We have reached the Falls of Rhoros. How far is that from Rivendell?" She was eager for information, reminding Ellenmeyer of herself when she had been much younger. Growing up, she had pestered Elrond every day with questions about birds, trees and the creation of Arda, of the Valar and the distant lands that she never thought she would have been able to see. She gave Mary Sue a small smile, wondering how such a trivial question could bring back so many fond memories of her foster father. "I do not know the exact distance, but we are many leagues away," Ellenmeyer answered, her eyes growing dim at the realization. "I have never been so far from home before. It is a little scary, isn't it?" Mary Sue cut in with understanding shimmering in her violet eyes. "At least, it's easier for you, knowing that you and those you love are still under the same sky. As for me, I'm not even from this world. I don't even know how I'll be able to go back to my home." It's a scary thought. Ellenmeyer froze, not exactly knowing how to respond to her. It was the most either of them had ever revealed to one another as if they were friends, and for a moment, an awkwardness settled between them. "We are more alike than I had cared to realize," Ellenmeyer found herself saying, "especially since we are not trying so hard to compete with each other over a certain someone." "You're right," Mary Sue agreed with a little laugh. "You're absolutely right. I guess when we have nothing to fight over, we can get along just fine." It was an odd feeling for Ellenmeyer, sharing her thoughts with someone she had once envied more than anyone, even more than the Evenstar. How was it possible that they got so close when they both did everything in their power to hurt one another? "Hey, look, I'm really sorry," Mary Sue said suddenly. "You know, about what I said to you when we first met. It was cruel of me to judge you as quickly as I did." "I was just as guilty as you were," Ellenmeyer interrupted, not wondering why she was admitting to it now. It was disconcerting how off guard she felt around this little girl she had thought she was so different from, only to discover that they were in essence, almost exactly the same. However, the only two females of the group had no time to ponder over their odd friendship when they heard the question that set all of them in a state of frenzy. "Where's Frodo?" Merry, his arms full of firewood he had collected, stood by the fire that Gimli and Pippin had started. He looked at one shocked face to another, realizing that no one knew how to answer him. Ellenmeyer's eyes immediately saw the empty spot in which Boromir had occupied only moments before. A sinking premonition settled unpleasantly in the pit of her stomach as she looked over at Aragorn, his expression showing that he suspected exactly the same thing she did. With Boromir acting the way he had been over the past couple of weeks, it was a sure sign that Frodo would not be safe in his presence. "Damn it!" Ellenmeyer yelped before she fled into the woods, paying no heed to the others as she quickly scanned the area, trying to take note of any broken branches or footprints left in the dirt. Panic shook her limbs as she thought of what Boromir was capable of. He was an excellent swordsman, and Frodo was no warrior. "We have let our guard down," she whispered to herself angrily, and she took no note of the cuts on her hands and face as she jumped through a thicket of sharp branches blocking her way. Her mind began to fill with doubt again as she frantically meandered throughout the woods with no clear path of where to go, or any clue as to what to do. She swallowed back the lump that had formed in her throat, helplessness weakening her yet again. She paused in her search, panting heavily as she forced herself to calm down. "You will not be able to fight should you get flustered again," she scolded herself. "Breathe, damn you, breathe." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus her energy into what was important, protecting Frodo at all costs. She had not the time to stumble in her mind's endless debate of her own self-worth, especially when Frodo needed her. Her eyes opened immediately when she heard a shout not too far from where she stood, and her legs sprung into action on their own accord, her instincts going into full swing. "I am coming, Frodo," she muttered in steely determination as the cries grew louder, clearer, and she nearly tripped on a moving log on the ground when she realized that the rolling object was Boromir. "Frodo, I'm sorry," the man was yelling insanely, his hands thrashing at the scattered leaves below him. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Ellenmeyer stared at him blankly, disbelief stilling her movements. Frodo was not near as far as she could tell, and the sight of the broken man before her disturbed her more than she showed. "Boromir," she whispered uncertainly and hesitated a moment before kneeling down next to him. "Where is he?" he demanded tearfully. "Where did he go?" "He is not here," she answered him, her hand discreetly moving to the hilt of her sword, but her precaution was not needed as he broke down once more into a sobbing fit. Not knowing what to do, she stayed as she was, contemplating whether to leave him in such a state and search for Frodo or to comfort the man she had once given her heart to. Ellenmeyer, I'm sorry, he mumbled almost incoherently as he flung himself at her, his arms wrapping around her waist as his head landed unceremoniously on her lap. I did not mean it, I did not mean to do what I did. Her eyes grew larger as she gaped at him. He only wept, his tears dropping down his cheeks in a steady pace, wetting her leggings. Out of old habit, her hand ran through his hair to comfort him the way she used to when they had been together, and she was surprised at how silky the strands still felt. Shish, she pacified, as he tightened his hold on her, only sobbing harder. You do not understand, he cried. I tried to take it from him, I tried to take the ring from Frodo. She refrained herself from gasping, though she should have known that with his odd behavior, she should not have been so surprised. You have not been yourself, Boromir, she comforted, her heart shattering at his breakdown and confession. It were not the images of the cold Boromir she had heard in Lothlorien but of the kind Boromir she had fallen in love with in Rivendell that she remembered as she cradled his head in her lap as if it were the most precious of pearls. You are not to be blamed. The unmistakable clanging of swords brought the two of them on alert as they broke free from one another, springing to their feet with the swords in their hands. The wave of black orcs were already upon them, and Ellenmeyer hardly had enough time to marvel at their speed when one came close and swung at her head with a cleaver. She immediately ducked beneath its swing, and her sword went swiftly through its chest before it fell down on the grassy floor, creating a bloody dark pool of mud beneath its dying body. However, not many of the other orcs seemed to care about her or Boromir for that matter, most seemed to be running away, as if in search of something far more important than them. Find the hobbits, one of them ordered in an angry growl. Find the hobbits. Boromir was at her side immediately, grabbing her arm to pull her along. We have to find them before they do, he barked at her, and she pulled her arm free from his grasp just in time to bring her sword up as an orc charged at her, running directly into the tip of her sword. She stared into its ugly, distorted face as its life sputtered away on her blade, and she recoiled, taking notice for the first time of its body, which was far more enormous than that of a regular orc. Wah, what are they? She yelled over the noise as they continued to flee in the same direction as the wave of black bodies. I overheard Aragorn talking to Celeborn in Lothlorien, Boromir explained over his shoulder. They are Uruk Hai, a cross between goblins and orcs, his voice cut off as he was squarely punched in his back. He stabbed two more Uruks as Ellenmeyer came under attack, but she swirled around swiftly, leaving 5 dead in her wake. There they are, Boromir cried out. Merry and Pip, he let out a strangled cry as he rushed over a makeshift bridge of a fallen tree where the two hobbits stood frozen in fear as an Uruk came charging at them. As its weapon began its descent upon their heads, Boromir grabbed the hilt in time, knocking the Uruk out of the way as he ushered Merry and Pippin close to him before he brought his horn to his lips and blew. The loud tune startled Ellenmeyer, and she nearly stumbled as she ran to catch up with the man and 2 hobbits, having forgotten that he had carried the heirloom with him wherever he traveled. He had told her once that it would always bring help whenever he needed it, and she only prayed that the tale would ring true as the 4 of them fought to keep the hobbits from out of their enemies' reach. Not too far off, Legolas heard the plaintive cry of the horn, and immediately stopped in his tracks, turning to the sound. The Horn of Gondor, he yelped, only to have Aragorn rush past him. Boromir, he barely had time to mutter as he encountered another attack. There's too many of them. Mary Sue cried out, wielding her own sword with expertise. They're not all attacking, lass, Gimli grunted. Hurry and follow the sound of the horn. Boromir is in dire need of help, Legolas hissed, shooting arrows in every which direction, though, he is not alone. What do you mean? Mary Sue sputtered, driving her sword into a mangled face, its black blood spurting out all over her. She barely had time to express her disgust when another Uruk cut into her right leg, and grimacing in pain, she hacked off his head in one swoop of her blade. Ellenmeyer is with him, I know it, Legolas said, running toward the sound of the blowing horn, Mary Sue and Gimli just behind him. Aragorn was the only one out of the 4 who advanced the farthest and the fastest, and Legolas fleetingly hoped that the heir could only reach Boromir and Ellenmeyer in time. Run! Boromir snapped at Merry and Pippin, but they paid no heed as they stayed, attacking any that dared to sneak up on their friends from behind. They held their daggers bravely, using their quickness to their advantage as they stabbed the Uruks from below. Ellenmeyer felt a shove on her shoulder, and she shot Boromir an irritated glare. There's no time to argue. He scowled. Take the hobbits and flee, now. But, she tried to protest. No time, just go. He yelled fiercely. It is your duty, Ellenmeyer. Let me divert their attention away. They will just hunt us down and annihilate us later. She countered. We will fight together as one. I will not leave you behind. For a moment, she saw a tiny spark of appreciation within the fire of his eyes, and he nodded, a small smile on his lips, painfully reminding her of the peaceful moments they stole together in the quiet of Rivendell. She hungrily drank in the expression on his face, not having seen such a reminder of his former self in what seemed like ages. His free hand caught hers, and he gave a gentle squeeze before he returned to the task at hand. She let her hand fall to her side, but she was unable to tear her gaze from him, wondering why it was only then her Boromir had come back. She fell to her knees as something slammed into her right shoulder, throwing her to the ground in a heap, her head landing hard on a slant of rock as she slipped. Blood trickled from the gash, but she could only blink skeptically at the black arrow embedded in her body. However, when she tried to raise her right arm, an electric bolt of pain made her gasp, and she twitched as she tried to get up. Boromir blinked blankly at the wound before angrily spinning around to glare at the offender who had injured her. He only had enough time to react and place his body between Elendmire and the next arrow that came flying in her direction. No, she screamed as he fell to her side, and she noted, though her head was spinning madly, that the arrow he had taken for her was buried just above where his heart was. Boromir, no, by some miracle, he was on his feet, as if he hadn't been hit at all, fighting to protect both the hobbits as well as Elendmire, who lay writhing in pain just behind him. Merry and Pippin, their faces crumbling, tried to rush to her, but as another orc approached from behind, they returned to their fighting with more zeal as Elendmire could do nothing but watch. I must do something, she growled through gritted teeth. I must. A thud snapped her out of her monologue as Boromir fell a second time, almost collapsing on top of her, and she exhaled sharply as the breath was knocked out of her. Her lids wanted to close, but she forced them open, squinting as she made out another arrow in the middle of Boromir's chest. He panted, his breathing growing laborious, but he rose to his feet once again, taking 4 more enemies down before another shot embedded an arrow in his stomach. No, Elendmire whimpered weakly, her eyes filling with tears as he stayed kneeling in front of her fallen body. Refusing to let him fight alone, she drew herself up, but to her utmost horror, Merry and Pippin were suddenly carried away from behind her, and she crawled on her side, reaching out her left arm to trip those who had grabbed her friends, but it was no use. Her eyes locked with Merry's tearful ones as he struggled against the strong arms that held him, and Elendmire sobbed, shaking her head. Using whatever energy she had left, she picked herself up on shaky legs to chase after them when another stinging pain engulfed her left thigh, and she fell again to the floor, landing hard on her injured shoulder. Her head rolled to the side, as Boromir collapsed beside her. The Uruk archer merely sneered at the two of them before he ran to follow his group, a sickeningly satisfied smile on his crooked lips. Boromir, her eyes were not deceiving her. Though the arrows were still protruding from within his torso, blood spots were forming where they had hit, and his face had already grown ashen, his lips pale. She sniffed nosily as he turned his gaze to her, and though the former couple inched closer to one another, one slipped toward death. Boromir coughed and sputtered, his punctured lungs now filling with liquid and blood, but even in his intense pain, he twitched his lips into a smile as if to reassure her, though the smile did not reach his eyes. It is over. His whisper could barely be heard, and she shook her head even more fervently at him, though she grimaced in agony that the movement caused her. She could barely see his face clearly through her blurry tears, but she could feel his gloved hand on her cheek, clutching to her as his glassy eyes tried to memorize the details of her face. No, she hissed at him angrily. We will not say goodbye here. I loved you still, he rasped, as though she had not spoken. Despite my words in the golden wood, I still loved you. Stop it, please, Boromir, she pleaded. Not like this, please do not. It is done. Boromir, Elendmire. The chorus of voices seemed so far away, she could not lift her head, but her entire body was on fire as arms gently wrapped around her and a pair of deep blue eyes flooded her line of vision. She turned away deliriously as she looked for Boromir, only to see Aragorn over him, speaking in soft tones. No, Boromir, Elendmire, Legolas whispered to her, we must clean your wounds. Thank the Valar they are not as deep. But Boromir, lie still, he instructed softly, his eyes filling with worry when she would not pay any heed to his words. He followed her gaze in time to see Aragorn place his hand over Boromir's eyes, closing them for one final time. No, Elendmire's voice was hoarse. No, 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 no. Her attempts to pull away were easily countered, and she pummeled weakly at Legolas's chest when he refused to let her go. Her shoulders shook as an anguished cry tore from her lungs, and she fought against Legolas with renewed vigor. He has passed, Legolas confirmed quietly as her tears began their quick flood down her cheeks, his hold on her still firm. He attempted to say, goodbye, she choked. I could not, no, no, my life, he protected, could end not say. A massive wave of guilt drowned her even deeper into her sorrow as she babbled inarticulately, but through the fragmented phrases, Legolas deduced that Boromir had in fact given his life for Merry and Pippin, and for Elendmire. His vision blurred as he stared at Boromir's corpse, finally able to appreciate his comrade's bravery and loyalty. Any thought of his weakness against the One Ring was burned away from memory as Ellenmeyer drooped in his arms, falling unconscious from her emotional turmoil and loss of blood. We must tend to her quickly, Aragorn stated evenly, approaching the two elves, and Boromir, his voice trailed off as he cleared his throat. We cannot leave him like carrion among these foul orcs, Legolas continued, knowing what Aragorn had wanted to say. But we must be swift. Gimli cut in, trudging slowly to the group before leaning against his axe. He would not wish us to linger. What happened? Mary Sue called out to them as she slowly jogged to the group, her eyes growing wide as she studied the scene before her. She was a little scathed, but was perfectly well overall. As her gaze landed on the fallen Boromir and injured Ellenmeyer, she let out a small gasp. Boromir. He is dead, Aragorn informed solemnly, turning away, and Mary Sue fought to control herself, but as she glanced down at Ellenmeyer, her resolve faded. Is she? Not yet, Legolas stated determinedly. She will live. Mary Sue nodded, though she looked doubtful as she kneeled next to him, brushing away Ellenmeyer's bloodied hair from her face. And what of the hobbits? Gimli gripped his axe anxiously. Where is Frodo? I do not know, Aragorn answered wearily, but we must hurry. We must make haste and follow, should there be survivors of our fellowship within their grasp. We have not the time to make a mound for Boromir, but we must give him a proper ceremony. He sighed heavily, his 80 or so years showing a little on his tired face, but as his determination flooded through his veins, he straightened, the leader buried within him beginning to emerge. Let us lay him in a boat with his weapons, and the weapons of his vanquished foes, he decided. We shall send him to the Falls of Rhoros and give him to Anduin. The river of Gondor will take care at least that no evil creature dishonors his bones. Ellenmeyer stood stoically on the shore, her eyes trained on the boat that carried her first love over to the Falls of Rhoros. She no longer had tears left as she watched the boat bobble gently along its path, but her heart skipped a few beats as the boat finally tipped over the edge, taking Boromir with it. A lump formed in her throat as the five of them bowed their heads reverently, and seconds later Legolas and Aragorn began a slow melody, singing of the north, south and west winds paying tribute to their fallen brother. She refused to cry any longer, bringing her hand to cup her injured shoulder, and though it stung, the pain was a bitter reminder that she was still alive because of Boromir. It would not do to mourn forever when they still had a mission to accomplish, a mission that Boromir had died for. He would not have wanted her to cry more tears than she had already, he would not have wanted her to waste the life he had fought bravely to protect. I will honor your gift and live, love, she whispered, hoping that the kind winds would carry her words to where he was now, praying that he could hear her. I vow to you, I will bring our friends back. I promise. Though she had sworn not to cry, a single teardrop found its way onto her cheek, and she allowed it to continue its path down the curve of her face. We cannot tarry, Aragorn commented, drawing her out of her thoughts. We will not abandon Merry and Pippin to torment to death. His eyes gleamed, and the two elves, dwarf and girl nodded in agreement, smiles of hope etched onto their faces. Let us away. He fled into the wood, and they took after him. Though her injured thigh protested at the sudden exertion, Ellenmeyer bore the ache, each painful step reminding her of what her true purpose was. She was still alive, and with his death, Boromir taught her the importance of her own existence. He fought and died for them all, and she was not about to let his sacrifice go to waste. She continued to run.